A friendly Oklahoma neighborhood is terrorized when a father and his teenage children fall victim to a deadly home intrusion.
There's blood everywhere. I can't go in there.
There's aggression, there's anger. This is a very in-your-face, direct attack.
The investigation will unravel dark secrets.
I just don't think they could stand each other.
Divorce causes emotions to run high, and bad things happen.
Had a family dispute turned deadly? Or was the true motive behind the crime something more startling and sinister?
It was an illegal relationship.
This was not somebody that you wanted to mess with. She was in love with him, and she would do anything he said. I was very shocked, because I just didn't see it coming.
A lot of people can't imagine that type of hatred or that type of evil could be next door.
May 13th, 2010, Guthrie, Oklahoma. It's just before 7 a.m. when an alarming 911 call comes into the local police station.
911.
My dad's dead.
Hey, where's this at?
My house. There's blood everywhere. I can't go in there.
The caller identifies herself as 15-year-old Kaleigh Fryer.
What's your dad's name?
Louis Fryer. He didn't wake me up in the morning. His car's gone. Everything's gone.
Is there blood? You said there's blood everywhere?
Yes, there's blood all over the floor. I tried to wake him up, and he didn't wake up.
I have him en route, okay?
Yes.
Gotta stay calm, okay?
I've never seen a dead body before.
Within minutes, first responders arrive at the home. They find the teenage caller waiting for them outside.
I observed Kaleigh Fryer sitting on the concrete floor on the carport, just sitting there crying. So at that point, when we enter the house, we do draw our weapons because you don't know what you're going into. You don't know if there's a suspect still in the residence.
You're on high alert, clearing the kitchen, bedrooms, closets, under the beds, just to make sure that that house is safe.
Officers locate the victim in the master bedroom.
They found Mr. Fryer deceased on the bedroom floor.
I saw laceration on the back, lacerations on his head area and torso, where he looked like he'd been in a fight.
The victim's injuries were obvious. He'd been stabbed in the neck and in the back, and there was a great deal of blood there on the bedroom floor.
Anytime we have a homicide like that, we'll contact the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations to come in.
I spoke with officers at the scene and was briefed of the situation, that there was a deceased male in the back bedroom and that his 15-year-old daughter had found him deceased, and she was sitting in a patrol car.
She was put in a unit just to get her out of public eye.
She was sobbing. This was a young lady that just found her father deceased.
Anytime there's a murder, it always shakes your community that you live in, and your first thoughts are, who could have possibly done this? Who would want to kill this man?
"50-year-old Louis Keith Fryer, or Louis to his friends and family, was the quintessential family man and proud father to his two children, Keith and Kaleigh.
My dad always did everything he could to be everything that we needed. He was really just like a stand-up parent.
The father of two had fallen in love with his children's mother, Tricia, nearly 2 decades before. While Louis was known for his quiet and collected demeanor, Tricia was the polar opposite.
She was very eccentric, very outgoing. Eccentric was is the best word for her.
Louis was drawn to Tricia's zest for life, and the two were married within a year. By 1994, the couple had expanded to a family of 4. Settling into a quaint home in Guthrie, Tricia stayed home with the kids, while Louis worked to support the family.
For work, my dad always worked for a high-end picture framing company. He was actually involved in the design of the frames.
But while Louis's career flourished, his marriage fell apart. In large part because Tricia had developed a drug habit that led to legal problems.
My early childhood, I don't remember a lot of my mom because she would come in and out of our lives because she did a lot of prison time. My dad had said we have to get a divorce, and she agreed to it.
She definitely loved them, but she wasn't very motherly. It was like she totally lacked that maternal instinct, and she just wanted to be their friend.
Louis and Tricia's divorce was finalized in 1997. Louis was awarded full custody of both kids. While being a single father had its challenges, Louis worked hard to build strong relationships with both his children.
My dad was a coach. That's the best way to describe him. He liked any sports, and he was constantly watching sports. Anything that the University of Oklahoma was doing, if OU was competing, he was watching it, especially football. The OU Texas game was like a family holiday for us. Every morning, he would take me to school, and I would let him just like spew all of his knowledge of any sport to me. He was constantly just trying to like just make our lives better in any way.
He treated his kids right, and I had a lot of respect for him.
But the Fryer family falls victim to a horrific tragedy on May 13, 2010. As a CSI unit examines the crime scene, officers ask Kaleigh Fryer to walk them through the events of the previous 12 hours.
She pretty much stated that her and her dad watched a movie the night before, and I believe roughly maybe 10:30 they went to bed. She went to her bed and he went to his bedroom.
On that morning, Kaleigh Fryer says she woke up at 7 a.m.
Kaleigh said that when she got up this morning, she was surprised that her dad had not waken her up, which he normally does.
So she got up and she went into his room, and that's when she found him. So that's when Agent Dean is saying, well, did you sleep through the night? Did you hear anything? She said, no, I slept all the way through the night. I didn't hear anything.
Inside Louis Fryer's bedroom, investigators with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation find evidence of a violent struggle.
There was blood on the bed. There was blood on the pillow. There was blood on the wall.
The room was in disarray. There was obvious defensive wounds to his body where he was trying to defend himself during the fight.
First thing that we think is robbery gone bad. You know, they break in, Louis discovers them, battle ensues, they kill him, they swipe the stuff and leave.
But that theory quickly loses traction when investigators study the position of Louis's body.
The blood on the bed was indicative that Louis Fryer was in bed at the time he was attacked, and that this was a very brutal attack, that Louis came out of the bed, fought his attacker, and made every attempt to save his own life there in that bedroom.
There was no forced entry into the home, so if this is being described as a burglary, you would have expected broken windows, broken door, and there were none. On top of that, there was not a scene of an obvious burglary in the house.
If nobody forced their way in, then it leads me to believe that the assailant was a known person to the family.
This was a very personal attack. When you're stabbing somebody 8 times, this is not a random act. There's aggression, there's anger. This is a very in-your-face, direct attack.
The question now facing Guthrie police is who would want to attack Louis Fryer in such a vicious way? And why?
Louis Fryer was a great dad. He was a nice guy in the community. There was no reason for someone to dislike him to this level.
Anybody and everybody is pretty much a suspect.
Coming up, investigators uncover conflict within the Fryer home.
I screamed at him and I told him he was lying, and I grabbed the chair from under me and I threw it against the wall.
And police ID someone from Louis Fryer's past with a potential motive.
Divorce is a motivator that causes emotions to run high and bad things happen.
In Guthrie, Oklahoma, OSBI agents are investigating the stabbing death of 50-year-old Louis Fryer. The crime scene unit continues processing the Fryer home and makes an ominous discovery in the kitchen.
It was believed that the murder weapon was a kitchen knife. There was a knife missing from the butcher block at that point.
Evidence suggests the killer had fled the scene through the back of the home.
Blood smears were found on the back door on the inside of the door, showing the subject had left out the back door.
So now the investigation began. Was Louis a target?
To answer that question, investigators with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation speak with the victim's 15-year-old daughter, Kaleigh.
The officers had placed her in a patrol car to keep her out of the scene, but keep her safe. I went and spoke to her in the patrol car.
Kaleigh tells investigators she believes whoever killed her dad had been there to rob him.
She informed me that her father's car was missing, that it had been parked in the driveway the night before.
Investigators immediately put out a bolo for Louis Fryer's missing vehicle.
We began a search for that vehicle, and we notified outlying agencies to be on the look for that particular vehicle, and if it was located, to notify us.
Before ending their interview, detectives ask Kaleigh if she can think of anyone who might target her father for money. She says she can't. But she does admit that her brother Keith had left home after a fight with their dad 3 days earlier.
Her brother had been living at a friend's house for a few days.
He had gotten in a fight at school and got kicked out of the house.
Kaleigh is transported to the station while police try to make contact with her mother. In the meantime, investigators head to Guthrie High School to speak with Louis's 18-year-old son, Keith.
As soon as second hour started, there was a knock at the classroom door. There was a bunch of cops, and they all escorted me to the principal's office. The entire time that I'm going from the classroom to the principal's office, like, I didn't understand. And whenever I got there, the principal wasn't in his office. Instead, there was an OSBI agent.
I did notify Louis's son that his father was deceased. And he became extremely emotional and upset.
I screamed at him. I just screamed at him, and I told him he was lying. And I grabbed the chair from under me and I threw it against the wall. I just punched the principal's door until it opened, and I just ran out into the hallway. They pulled me back into the principal's office eventually whenever I had calmed down.
Investigators press Keith about his relationship with his father.
I got in a fight at school, and my dad's rule was, once you turn 18, you get in a fight at school, you're out of the house. So I was out of the house only 3 days before it all happened.
But Keith claims the move was only temporary.
The day of that he had kicked me out, he went and had lunch with one of my close friends, and he told my friend, well, as soon as he comes crawling back, I'll let him back in.
Homicide detectives asked Keith for his whereabouts the previous 24 hours.
He had stated he was with friends the night before.
He had an alibi of where he was at, which eliminated him.
He asked me if my dad had any enemies, and I was just like, what do you mean?
Keith provides detectives with more insight into his family's history. They learn Louis was divorced from his children's mother, Tricia. Police release Keith and dig deeper into Louis's relationship with his ex.
Divorce is a motivator that causes emotions to run high and bad things happen.
Investigators attempt to call Tricia, but they are unable to reach her.
There were questions initially about her because she was difficult to find. It was no secret that she was a drug addict, that she was not someone who was stable.
Police are surprised when Tricia Fryer unexpectedly arrives at the station later that afternoon. She claims her phone had been dead, and she'd been nearly an hour away in Oklahoma City all night. Tricia also swears she would never harm the father of her children, especially over custody.
My dad would let her see us more than what the courts had even demanded. He decided that she could have us for any weekend, and it wasn't every weekend that she was able to, but a lot of weekends she would try, and she would have us for the weekend.
Investigators quickly rule out Tricia as a possible suspect. They next request to speak with her daughter Kaleigh for a second time. Tricia agrees and sits with Kaleigh while the 15-year-old tries to shed light on her father's mysterious death.
Some of the questions that Kaleigh was asked was, who did this? Any arguments with anybody?
Now, who would want to kill your dad?
I don't know.
See any enemies?
No. Everybody likes my dad.
Given the lack of forced entry, investigators ask Kaleigh if anyone else has access to the home.
As he's questioning her, do people normally come over to your house? Do you have a lot of company? She says, no, that just didn't happen. Your father didn't allow it.
With Kaleigh unable to offer any more information, authorities head back to the crime scene.
We walked around asking if anybody had heard anything, seen anything, any suspicious activity at that residence.
Police are unable to locate witnesses who had seen anything suspicious the night before. But as they continue speaking with neighbors, two of Kaleigh Fryer's friends come forward with valuable information.
They probably offered the most information about everything going on at that house because they knew Kaleigh, they knew Mr. Fryer.
Kaleigh's friends say Louis was a good dad, but he had become very strict about Kaleigh's social life.
Kaleigh was a fighter. I mean, she stood her ground. She didn't put up with no BS. Kaleigh was not somebody you wanted to mess with. People knew that if it came down to it, she wouldn't be afraid to throw hands and get in somebody's face.
She was always getting in a fight at school. She got expelled from the same school 3 different times.
She had not been in school for quite a while, and she just did what she wanted while her dad was at work. People were coming in and out when Louis Fryer was not at home. There were parties there. She was using drugs and alcohol.
Her dad was trying to put his foot down and trying to establish some rules inside the home that she wasn't in favor of.
That's when friends reveal that Kaleigh had started sneaking around behind her father's back.
It was determined that Miss Fryer had a boyfriend.
They knew that he was 21 years old while Kaleigh was 15. It was clear that Kaleigh was telling a story different from what Kaleigh's friends provided to law enforcement.
Police are asking themselves, why didn't Kaleigh not mention this boyfriend at the beginning?
It's been 8 hours since 15-year-old Kaleigh Fryer found her father, Louis Fryer, stabbed to death. When investigators learned that Kaleigh had kept a big secret from her dad.
Miss Fryer had a boyfriend that was a 21-year-old male.
There's always the question, what's a 21-year-old guy dating a 15-year-old daughter?
Kaleigh's friends tell investigators that Kaleigh had been dating Jerry J. Chiles since February of 2010.
We all had the same group of friends, so I believe that's how they probably met. And then just over time, got together.
Me and Jay at that time were best friends. His personality, he was very shy and quiet. Kaleigh was fun and outgoing, and she loved to just do different things. It didn't matter what it was, she was down for it. The way they looked at each other was, you could just tell that they had that bond and that connection.
I thought the age difference was a little odd, but I didn't put too much thought into it because I knew that Kaleigh kind of preferred guys that were just a bit older. I thought that their maturity levels kind of matched up.
According to friends, Kaleigh knew her father wouldn't approve of the age difference between her and Jay, so she kept their relationship hidden from him.
I hung out with Jay and Kaleigh at her house while her father wasn't at home. I remember we just spent the time watching TV and just hanging out until her father was about to be home, and then Jay would just sneak out.
Jay was relatively homeless at the time. He had been kicked out of his house. He had gone to live with another friend, had been removed from that house, and was staying on the couch of another person. He was not stable, had nowhere to go, didn't have a car, didn't have a job, had no money.
Jay did stay at Kaleigh's house when her dad was not around.
But investigators learned that just 3 days earlier, Louis had discovered Kaleigh's secret romance with Jay.
My dad wasn't aware of the relationship until I was kicked out and I told him about it. He wasn't happy about it for the age difference, and that's not something he would condone by any means.
Beyond his own personal disapproval, Louis was also well aware that the romance between Kaleigh and Jay wasn't legal in the state of Oklahoma.
Being that he was over 18, she was 15 at the time, I mean, she didn't meet the statutory level of consent for her and Jay to be having a sexual type relationship.
It was an illegal relationship.
Intent on putting an end to the romance, Louis Fryer had tracked Jay Chiles down the next day as he walked through the Fryers' neighborhood.
My dad was in his car and he was driving by him and he just stopped and he was like, hey, you're a lot older than my daughter and I'd like you to not see her anymore.
Kaleigh's dad did want them to break up.
But according to Kaleigh's friends, it seems that Louis's demand had fallen on deaf ears.
After my dad told Jay that he didn't want him to see his daughter anymore, they still continued to go about it as if it didn't happen.
Kaleigh's father did not allow Jay Chiles to be in the home, but her friends knew that he frequently was there, that he would come after her father had gone to bed at night, or he would come when her father was at work.
The revelation that Jay and Kaleigh continued to see each other despite her father's wishes leads detectives to question whether the couple's illicit romance might have something to do with Louis Fryer's violent death.
Once that came to light, that's where the focus was at, to try to find the boyfriend.
When calls to Jay's cell phone go unanswered, investigators initiate an APB for the 21-year-old.
We began looking for Mr. Chiles just to do an interview and see what he possibly knew.
It seemed like it made a lot of sense that Jay was the one who did it. In my head, I didn't even point to him, so it kind of took me by surprise, but not really. And from that point, I was pretty convinced it was him.
While police attempt to locate Jay, they also double their search efforts for Louis's missing vehicle.
Investigators believed early on that whoever had Louis Fryer's vehicle would be the person that had taken his life.
It isn't long before detectives get a tip.
We had received notice from Valley Brook, Oklahoma, that a vehicle matching that description with the tag number was located abandoned.
The car had been called in by somebody in the neighborhood, a suspicious car in the neighborhood, and that's what led police to the car.
It appears the vehicle had been abandoned.
OSBI looked for any forensic evidence that could be located. None was found in the vehicle. The only thing that was located in the vehicle were the keys, which were in the center console.
It was determined that any type of murder weapon was not located.
A canvass of the area turns up no other leads. But as authorities expand their search, they receive a tip that Jay Chiles has been located in Oklahoma City.
He actually called somebody to come and pick him up.
When he called me, I was very confused. He said, "Can you please come pick me up? I'm stuck down here." He wants me to find him a ride, and I'm not gonna do that. I told him that OSBI wanted to ask him a question or two and to please just come in and talk to them.
He had stated he was down at the Crossroads Mall area, which is just a few blocks from Valley Brook.
I didn't want them to like throw him on the ground. I said he's willing to come in and talk, and this is where he's at, and this is where you can pick him up.
Investigators quickly assemble a team to bring Jay Chiles in.
You're trying to get resources from other agencies and stuff there to help them as quickly as possible so he doesn't leave.
They did locate Chiles outside the mall. He was taken into custody without incident.
Okay, we got him in custody. Now let's get him back up here for questioning.
Coming up, authorities sit down with their primary person of interest, but a shocking admission points to a new possible suspect.
This was not somebody that you wanted to mess with.
I don't know that anybody ever suspected anything like this.
11 hours into the murder investigation of Louis Fryer, police have taken their primary suspect and the boyfriend of Louis's daughter, Kaleigh, 21-year-old Jay Chiles, into custody.
Jay is interrogated by law enforcement, and he says he didn't have anything to do with it. He doesn't know what happened to Mr. Fryer.
But as investigators press Jay about his relationship with Kaleigh, Jay finally admits that he had been staying over in Kaleigh's bedroom for the past several nights.
He was not allowed at the house, and he was not wanted around there, according to her dad. So Kaleigh would let Jay know when her dad was sleeping, and Jay would come over and be with Kaleigh. On the day of the murder, Kaleigh asked him to come after her father had gone to bed at night. She tells him that she'll leave the back door open.
He had stated that he had went into the residence to spend the night that night at the Fryer residence by sneaking in with Miss Fryer's permission.
But Jay tells investigators that Louis must have woken up and heard Jay sneak into the house, because moments after Jay arrived, both he and Kaleigh could hear her father walking down the hall and approaching her room.
Jay told detectives that he had snuck into the house and later was found inside the bedroom with Kaleigh. Louis became irate.
He said that Mr. Fryer went back to his bedroom, got a golf club.
Jay says he panicked because he didn't know what Louis was going to do, so he went into the kitchen and got a knife to defend himself.
He said Mr. Fryer came at him with a golf club and that he had simply defended himself by using the knife.
He's saying that the struggle happened in the hallway.
But investigators aren't buying Jay's story of self-defense.
Agent Dean tells him there's no blood in the hallway.
The golf clubs were located inside the closet.
Louis's feet were against the closet door, so the closet door couldn't have opened.
It was impossible for a golf club to have been used, and no other golf club was found outside of the closet. So that, we knew, was not a true story.
Blood evidence found at the crime scene also doesn't line up with Jay's statement.
Agent Dean confronted him. Hey, how did the blood get on the bed then?
We know that Louis Fryer was in his bed when he was attacked. We know that most likely he was asleep, and we know that because there's the blood on the bed, and we know he went from the bed to the floor.
Confronted with the evidence from the crime scene, Jay changes his story. He admits that he had come to the house with the intention of robbing Louis Fryer, but claims Louis was never supposed to get hurt.
He said that, I went to the house about 3 o'clock in the morning. I came in through the back door. He said he actually said something to Kaleigh, but he doesn't remember if Kaleigh even responded to him. But he walked into the bedroom. He decided he's going to just get the money, get the wallet, and get the valuables. And when he did that, he said he made some noise. And Mr. Fryer started to move.
Jay says in that moment, he panicked.
Mr. Chiles then began to attack Mr. Fryer while he was in bed. Mr. Fryer did try to fight back and was hollering for help at the time of the attack.
Lewis tries to fight him off. That's when he stabs him in the neck.
Once Louis had stopped fighting back, Jay says he took Louis's car keys and fled out the back door. But something about Jay's story still doesn't add up for investigators. Why had Jay armed himself with a knife if he only meant to rob Louis Fryer?
In the third story that Jay tells Agent Dean is when he finally tells him Kaleigh showed him where the knife was.
Jay implicates Kaleigh as being a motivating or driving factor behind this.
Investigators asked Jay to explain what motivation Kaleigh might have to kill her father. According to Jay, Kaleigh had grown increasingly tired of her father's attempts to control her dating life.
Jay's belief is that her father is mean to her and has too many rules. And she wants her dad dead because she believes with him dead, she'll be allowed to live with her mom and she'll be happy and she and Jay can be together.
Jay alleged that Kaleigh Fryer asked him on numerous occasions to murder her father. At first, he said no.
But when Kaleigh's brother got kicked out of the home, Kaleigh found a new opportunity to once more ask Jay to kill her dad. And this time, she revealed a secret that, according to Jay, finally persuaded him to take her plans seriously.
He was told by Miss Fryer that she was pregnant with his child.
Jay said that, Kaleigh said her dad would never agree to them being together.
She wanted to live with him and them have a family together, and that she had given him this plan of how they were able to do this.
This is somebody who's been kicked out of his house, and Kaleigh offers him a plan that they're going to go live with her mother, they're going to be happy, they're going to have a place to live, and this just offers him something that he can't turn down.
Ultimately, Jay agreed to help Kaleigh. He arrived at the Fryers' house in the early morning hours of May 10th, after Kaleigh had called to let him know that her father was asleep.
Mr. Chiles was told to come into the residence through the unlocked back door after they had went to bed.
She would leave the back door open.
She also showed him which knife to use that was in a block of knives that was located on the kitchen counter, and instructed him to go into the bedroom and stab Mr. Fryer to death.
He talks about he's going in with the intent to murder him.
Mr. Chiles had stated he was standing at the foot of the bed looking at Mr. Fryer while Mr. Fryer was sleeping, and stated that he almost didn't do it.
He says that he stood over him and Louis moved a little bit and he just started stabbing him.
Jay says he panicked because he didn't know what Louis was going to do.
Mr. Chiles stated that Miss Fryer did not come in to assist him during the attack, that she had stayed in her room during the entire incident.
Jay tells investigators that after Louis was dead, he fled in Louis's car.
Kaleigh told him where he keeps the keys to the car.
Mr. Chiles stated that he did take the vehicle and did drive to Oklahoma City like he was instructed.
He says that after the murder, that when he flees, he throws the knife out the window somewhere off of I-35.
Jay says once he got to Oklahoma City, he ditched the car and called Kaleigh.
They talked for a minute, and Kaleigh said that she was going to call 911 as soon as she hung up.
The plan was that Kaleigh would make arrangements to meet him at the mall or pick him up at the mall. This never happened.
Jay had been phoning, trying to get a hold of Miss Fryer, that she was supposed to have picked him up.
He thinks she and her mother are coming to pick him up at the mall, and they never arrive.
He went on to state that he did regret and felt very bad about what had happened to Mr. Fryer.
Authorities officially charged Jay Chiles with first-degree murder. They then obtain an arrest warrant for Kaleigh Fryer, who has been in her mother's custody since the investigation began. At 10:40 p.m. that evening, less than 16 hours after the 15-year-old had called 911, police arrest Kaleigh outside a restaurant where she is eating dinner with her mother.
She was crying. She was pretty upset. I don't know if she was upset she got caught or she was upset that she realized that she was a part of killing her dad.
Kaleigh lawyers up immediately.
Once you get asked for an attorney, you're not interviewed.
Kaleigh was booked into the Logan County Jail there in Guthrie, and she was charged with 1 count of murder in the first degree.
With the alleged co-conspirators behind bars, investigators must decipher if what Jay told them is true.
I was very shocked. It just didn't make sense how she could just all of a sudden want her dad dead, and it also didn't make sense that Jay would just go do it.
I was just kind of blown away that a 15-year-old can convince a 21-year-old to kill her dad.
In Guthrie, Oklahoma, 15-year-old Kaleigh Fryer and her 21-year-old boyfriend, Jay Chiles, have been arrested for the murder of Kaleigh's father, Louis Fryer. While Jay has admitted to the stabbing, he's implicated Kaleigh as the crime's true mastermind.
Anytime you have a 15-year-old child that dislikes her dad so much to put a plan in place to kill him, it shocked a lot of people in our community.
When investigators secure warrants for Kaleigh's phone records, her communication with Jay only strengthens his claims.
Kaleigh had told the initial investigator, Michael Dean, that she slept through the night. We know the murder happened approximately 3 a.m., but at 3:30 a.m. she is awake and accessing the internet through her phone. And then we know at 6:59 is the call from Jay Chiles before she makes the 911 call. She's there in the house with her father's body from 3 a.m. until law enforcement arrives shortly after 7. So about 4 hours. You have to wonder, what was she doing all that time?
Kaleigh's phone records aren't the only damning evidence investigators uncover.
Upon searching the residence, they had found a diary that was Miss Fryer's diary. Upon reviewing the diary, there were several different entries pertaining to how much she hated her father. It was very hateful things that she had written.
With Kaleigh's trial looming, authorities receive surprising news from the women's prison.
All the jail phone calls are recorded, and normally before trial we have an investigator assigned or someone assigned to listen to the jail calls. The fact that Kaleigh was not pregnant came out in jail phone calls with her mother.
When Jay Chiles learns of the development, he's heartbroken.
This is another piece of the puzzle. The fact that she was not pregnant is Kaleigh manipulating Jay Chiles to do what she wants. She manipulated Jay into doing what she wanted, and she got what she wanted.
In July 2010, Jay Chiles makes the decision to plead guilty to his role in the crime.
In exchange for Mr. Chiles' testimony, he agreed to a plea bargain of first-degree murder and theft of an auto.
If he would testify truthfully at her trial, the state would not request life without parole for him, that it would only be life.
In May 2011, 1 year after her father's murder, 16-year-old Kaleigh Fryer is tried as an adult in a Logan County courtroom.
If it's a crime of homicide or an aggravated felony of some degree, they can choose to charge her as an adult.
At trial, Jay took the stand and he testified against Kaleigh. It was emotional testimony. He was very honest and Is it a brutal account of what happened?
I believe Jay's motive for it all was to have a happily ever after life with Kaleigh. I honestly think she wasn't looking at that life to be with Jay. And her whole thing with the plan was, as long as she don't do the murder, she's not going down for it.
Despite Kaleigh's claims of innocence, a jury finds her guilty of first-degree murder on May 17, 2011.
Kaleigh Fryer was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder. In the state of Oklahoma, life with parole is determined to be 45 years, and it is an 85% crime. You have to serve 85% of that 45-year sentence before you're eligible for parole. And Jerry Chiles received the same sentence.
Jay made his own decisions, and he stood over an innocent person with a knife and brutally stabbed him to death. Kaleigh was the mastermind behind this. If it hadn't been for her words, this would have never happened and her father would be alive.
I'm still not sure that she had much to do with it. She was 15 years old. She didn't do the stabbing, he did. And I honestly think he probably should have got more time.
I think both Kaleigh and Jay had problems and they fed off of each other.
Our belief is and always will be that justice has been served in this case, that Kaleigh Fryer, despite her age, the jury was able to see the facts of the case, the jury was able to discern the truth, and they were able to render both a verdict and recommend a sentence that we believe is just for the death of Louis Keith Fryer.
The most disturbing thing to me is I think Mr. Fryer was doing the absolute best he could to raise his daughter as a single parent.
On a bitter December evening in 1957, a 7-year-old girl stepped outside to play with a friend, and within minutes, she disappeared into a mystery that would survive for more than half a century. Her name was Maria Ridulph. She lived in Sycamore, Illinois, a quiet community where children could still gather outside without adults hovering over every movement. That evening, Maria was playing near the corner of Archie Place and Center Cross Street with her 8-year-old friend, Kathy Sigmund. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. It was familiar. It was ordinary. It was the kind of winter evening that should have ended with 2 children going home for dinner. Instead, it became the beginning of one of America's longest and most controversial murder investigations. Maria was a 2nd-grade student at West School. Kathy lived only several houses away. The girls knew the neighborhood, knew the streets, and knew the people who lived around them. Then a young man appeared. He called himself Johnny. He spoke to the girls. He interacted with them, and according to Kathy's later account, he offered to give Maria a piggyback ride. It was a brief encounter, but it would become the center of the entire investigation. Maria eventually went home to get a doll. Then she returned outside. The girls continued playing. The evening moved forward as usual until suddenly Maria was gone. Kathy later reported seeing Maria with Johnny around the time she disappeared. Shortly afterward, Kathy went home. Maria did not. At first, there was no reason to understand the disappearance as anything more than a child who had wandered away. But as the minutes passed, concern grew. Maria's family began searching. Neighbors became involved. The quiet streets of Sycamore filled with people looking for a little girl who had vanished without explanation. Her parents could not have known that they were entering the first hours of a nightmare that would last for generations. Police were notified that evening. The search intensified. People checked nearby areas and searched for any sign of Maria. Her doll was eventually found near a garage, but there was no Maria. No clear trail, no message, no explanation, only the memory of a young stranger called John. That name would become one of the most haunting details in the case because Johnny was not simply a vague figure from a distant memory. He was reportedly the last person known to have been with Maria before she disappeared. The description provided by Kathy became crucial. Investigators wanted to know who this young man was, where he came from, and what he had done with Maria. The case quickly became larger than Sycamore. The FBI became involved in the investigation, and federal agents established a presence in the area. Investigators conducted interviews and examined possible suspects. The search for Maria became a massive operation. The disappearance attracted national attention, and the fear surrounding the case spread far beyond the small Illinois community. A child had disappeared in an era when many American families still believed their neighborhoods were safe. Now, every stranger became a possibility. Every unfamiliar face became a potential clue. Every young man matching the description of Johnny could attract attention. The FBI and local authorities followed leads, questioned people, and attempted to reconstruct Maria's final hour, but there was no immediate breakthrough. No suspect could be conclusively tied to the disappearance. The investigation stretched on. The longer Maria remained missing, the darker the possibilities became. Her family had no way of knowing whether she was alive. Every passing day carried uncertainty. Then came the discovery that changed the case forever. On April 26, 1958, nearly 5 months after Maria disappeared, 2 people searching for mushrooms in a wooded area near Woodbine, Illinois, discovered the remains of a small child beneath a partially fallen tree. The search for Maria was over, but the answer was devastating. The remains were identified as Maria Ridolph through dental records. She had been found approximately 90 miles from Sycamore. The missing child had not wandered away. She had not simply disappeared into another town. She had been killed, and her body had been concealed in a remote wooded area. The discovery transformed a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. Now, investigators had to answer an even more difficult question: who had taken Maria from Sycamore and transported her so far away? The physical condition of the remains meant that investigators had limited information about exactly how Maria died. Later legal proceedings would examine the medical evidence in detail, but the original investigation faced enormous challenges. Months had passed. The body had been exposed to the elements. Potential evidence had deteriorated. Memories were already fading. The killer had an enormous head start, yet the investigation continued. Investigators returned to the people who had been near Maria that evening. They examined the description of Johnny. They questioned possible suspects. One name that eventually entered the investigation belonged to an 18-year-old man named John Tessier. He lived in Sycamore. He was close in age to the person Kathy had described, and he was living near Maria. That alone made him a person investigators wanted to question. Tessier denied involvement. He said he had been in Rockford on the night Maria disappeared. The question became whether that story could be verified. Investigators examined his account. A collect telephone call from Rockford to his parents' home was recorded at approximately 6:57 that evening. Later, evidence placed Tessier at the Rockford post office, where he encountered military recruitment officers. The FBI interviewed Tessier and his parents in December 1957. Tessier also took a polygraph examination and passed it. Ultimately, the FBI cleared him as a suspect. He later left Sycamore for military training. At that moment, the case appeared to have moved away from him, but history would eventually return to his name. For decades, there was no arrest in Maria's murder. The case became one of those mysteries that seemed destined to remain unresolved. The people who had known Maria grew older. The children who had played in Sycamore became adults. The original investigators aged and retired. Some died. Memories that had once been vivid became distant recollections. Yet Maria's name remained connected to one unanswered question. Who was Johnny? The case was not forgotten, but it became increasingly difficult to solve using traditional investigative methods. There was no modern DNA profile capable of producing a direct identification. There was no video footage. There were no digital records tracking movements. The investigation depended heavily on witnesses, physical evidence, and memories from a single winter evening more than half a century earlier. Then, decades later, something extraordinary happened. A new claim emerged from inside the family of the man once known as John Tessier, who had later become Jack McCullough. A relative reported a deathbed statement allegedly implicating McCullough in Maria's disappearance. Suddenly, a name that had been cleared by investigators in 1957 was back at the center of the case. The authorities reopened the investigation. The passage of time had not erased the case. It had transformed it. Investigators now had access to old records, newly located information, and witnesses who were decades older than they had been when Maria disappeared. But there was a fundamental problem. The new investigation had to reconstruct an event that had occurred more than 50 years earlier. Memory is not a photograph. It changes with time. It can be strengthened by repeated retelling. It can be influenced by information learned years later. That would become especially important because Kathy Sigmund, the 8-year-old girl who had been with Maria on the night of the disappearance, was now an adult. She was asked to revisit memories from an evening she had experienced as a child more than half a century earlier. Her recollections became central to the renewed case. The investigation now had a strange shape. On one side was the original evidence that had cleared Tessier. On the other was a new allegation emerging decades later. The authorities had to determine whether the later account was reliable enough to overcome the earlier evidence. The stakes were enormous. If McCullough was truly Johnny, then investigators had finally found the man who had taken Maria. If he was not, then the case could once again be heading toward the wrong conclusion. In 2012, prosecutors brought McCullough to trial. The case was presented to a judge rather than a jury. The prosecution argued that McCullough was the man who had approached Maria and Kathy that night and that he had ultimately killed Maria. The evidence included witness testimony and other circumstances assembled from the decades-old investigation. The case was remarkable not only because of its age, but because the prosecution was asking a court to determine what had happened on a dark December evening more than 50 years earlier. The trial captured national attention. After decades without an answer, the mystery appeared to be ending. McCullough was convicted of Maria's kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. For many observers, the story seemed complete. A child who disappeared in 1957 finally had a named killer. A family that had waited decades finally had an answer. A cold case had apparently been solved. But beneath the appearance of closure, serious questions remained. The evidence surrounding McCullough's whereabouts on the night Maria disappeared would become increasingly important. The old telephone record from Rockford, the military recruitment encounter, the earlier FBI investigation, the fact that investigators had once cleared him, the reliability of memories formed in childhood and recalled decades later. Each detail raised a question about whether the conviction could survive deeper examination. The legal system would eventually revisit those questions. In 2016, an Illinois judge vacated McCullough's conviction and ordered a new trial. Prosecutors then moved to dismiss the case, and the charges were ultimately dismissed. In 2017, McCullough received a certificate of innocence. The man who had been convicted as Maria's killer was officially cleared. The dramatic conclusion of the cold case had collapsed, and with it came the most disturbing realization of all. After more than 50 years, Maria Ridulph's murder still did not have a legally established killer. The case had traveled from disappearance to massive search, from missing child to homicide, from an unidentified Johnny to a convicted suspect, and finally, from conviction to exoneration. The mystery had survived every attempt to close it. That left the story exactly where it had begun, with Maria, a little girl standing on a neighborhood street in Sycamore, and a stranger who called himself Johnny. Somewhere between the moment he approached the children and the moment Maria vanished, the course of her life changed forever. The answer to what happened afterward remained buried in the past. The most haunting part was that the people involved had spent decades trying to reconstruct only a few minutes. Those minutes had become more powerful than 50 years of history. The investigation had grown older, but the unanswered question had remained the same. Who was John, and what really happened to Maria after she left that street? The answer had once seemed within reach. Then it disappeared again. The night Maria Ridulph disappeared had lasted only a few hours, but the investigation that followed would stretch across generations, and as the years accumulated, the smallest details of that evening became increasingly important. There was no video recording of the street. There were no cell phone records. There was no modern forensic database waiting to produce a name. Investigators had to reconstruct the final moments of Maria's life through people who had been there. And at the center of those memories was a child named Kathy Sigmund. She was 8 years old when she watched Maria speak with the young man who called himself Johnny. At that age, Kathy could not have known that every detail she remembered would later be examined by police officers, federal agents, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, journalists, and investigators searching for answers decades after the event. Her memory became one of the most important pieces of the case because Maria herself was gone. Kathy was the surviving witness who had been closest to the disappearance. She remembered a young man approaching the girls. She remembered the name Johnny. She remembered his interaction with Maria. She remembered Maria leaving briefly to get her doll and returning to the street. Then Maria disappeared. In the immediate aftermath, investigators naturally turned to Kathy for information. What did Johnny look like? What did he say? What was he wearing? How long had he been there? Where had Maria gone? Every question mattered. Investigators were attempting to build a picture of a stranger who had appeared in an ordinary neighborhood and vanished with a child. But there was a fundamental limitation. Kathy was a child. Her memory was being recorded under extraordinary circumstances, and the investigation itself was evolving around her recollection. The description she provided became part of the search for Johnny, and authorities compared it with people they encountered. One of those people was John Tessier. Was 18, lived in Sycamore, and fit some elements of the general description. He was therefore questioned. But the investigation did not end with suspicion. Authorities sought to establish where he had been on the evening of December 3rd. Tessier maintained that he had been in Rockford. The claim mattered because Rockford was approximately 40 miles from Sycamore, making his alleged presence there potentially inconsistent with the crime. Investigators eventually uncovered records that supported important parts of his account. A collect telephone call had been placed from Rockford to the Tessier home at approximately 6:57 that evening. That call was significant because it placed Tessier away from Sycamore during a critical portion of the timeline. There was also evidence concerning his presence at the Rockford post office later that night, where he encountered military recruitment officers. The FBI questioned him and his parents. Tessier submitted to a polygraph examination and passed it. The Bureau ultimately cleared him. He then left the area to enter military training. The investigation continued without him. At the time, that decision seemed to settle the question of Tessier's involvement. He was not the mysterious Johnny. At least, that was the conclusion reached by investigators in the late 1950s. But cold cases have a strange relationship with time. A person can be cleared, forgotten, and then suddenly returned to the center of the investigation decades later because one new piece of information changes the interpretation of everything that came before. That is precisely what happened in Maria's case. For more than 50 years, the investigation remained unresolved. There were theories, suspects, and rumors, but no conviction that could survive the absence of a definitive answer. Maria's family continued living with the knowledge that the person responsible for her death had never been held accountable. Her name remained in the records. Her photograph remained a reminder of the child she had been before that December night. The original investigators were long gone from active duty. The town itself had changed. The streets where Maria once played remained, but the world around them was different. Then, in the early 21st century, a new allegation emerged. A relative of Jack McCullough, the man who had once been known as John Tessier, reported a claim connected to a deathbed statement. According to the later account, a family member had heard that McCullough had been involved in Maria's disappearance. The allegation was extraordinary because it pointed directly toward a man the FBI had investigated and cleared more than 50 years earlier. The case was reopened. Suddenly, investigators were looking at old evidence with a new theory. The problem was that the new theory had to overcome the original investigation. It had to explain why Tessier had been cleared. It had to address the evidence that placed him in Rockford. It had to explain the passage of time, and it had to establish whether the memories of witnesses who had been children in 1957 were reliable enough to support a murder conviction in the 21st century. The investigators were now dealing with two versions of the past. One version was the 1957 investigation, which Tessier had been questioned and cleared. The other was the later investigation, in which he became the primary suspect. The difference between them was not simply new evidence. It was a new interpretation of old memories. Kathy Sigmund was again at the center of the story. More than 5 decades had passed since she stood with Maria on that street. She was now an adult woman. Her childhood memory of Johnny had remained with her throughout her life, but memories can become complicated when years of information accumulate around them. Investigators asked her to revisit what she remembered. Eventually, she identified McCullough as the man she believed she had seen with Maria. That identification became a critical element of the prosecution's case. For prosecutors, the importance was obvious. Here was a surviving witness who had actually been present when Maria disappeared. If she could identify the man she had seen that night, the cold case might finally have an answer. But the defense challenged the reliability of the identification. More than 50 years had passed. Kathy had been 8 years old. The original description had been recorded long before the modern identification. The defense argued that the passage of time and subsequent exposure to information about the case could have influenced her memory. The question was no longer simply whether Kathy sincerely believed McCullough was Johnny. The question was whether that belief could be considered reliable enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction became central. A witness can be honest and still be mistaken. A memory can feel vivid and still be inaccurate. A person can genuinely believe that a face belongs to someone they saw decades earlier, while the connection may have been formed through years of reconstruction. The court had to decide what weight to give that memory. At the same time, prosecutors examined other evidence. They looked again at McCullough's movements. They considered the relationship between him and the community. They examined the old investigation. The prosecution sought to establish that the young man known as Johnny had been McCullough, but the original FBI investigation presented an obstacle. The Bureau had already examined Tessier shortly after Maria disappeared. Agents had questioned him. His parents had been interviewed. He had taken a polygraph. The FBI had obtained information supporting his alibi. He was cleared. That did not automatically prove innocent, but it meant that the later prosecution had to explain why the earlier investigators had reached a different conclusion. The legal system was now asking a judge to revisit an investigation conducted in a completely different era. The evidence had aged. The witnesses had aged. Some of the original records had become historical artifacts. Yet the consequences were immediate. If McCullough was guilty, Maria's family would finally receive justice. If he was innocent, the state risked repeating the same tragedy that had haunted the case from the beginning, blaming the wrong person while the real killer remained free. In 2012, the case finally went to trial. McCullough waived a jury trial, and a judge heard the evidence. The prosecution presented its theory of what had happened in 1957. Maria had been approached by Johnny. Johnny had gained her trust. Maria had been taken from the neighborhood. Her body had later been found in a wooded area. The prosecution argued that the person behind the name Johnny was McCullough. The defense attacked the identification and emphasized the evidence supporting his whereabouts in Rockford. The trial became a collision between memory and records, between a decades-old eyewitness recollection and evidence created much closer to the night of the disappearance. The court ultimately found McCullough guilty. The sentence was life in prison. For the first time in more than 50 years, there was a legal answer to the question of who had killed Maria Ridulph. The case seemed to have reached the ending that generations of investigators had failed to achieve. Newspapers reported the conviction. The story became a dramatic example of a cold case solved after more than half a century. But beneath that apparent closure was a problem that refused to disappear. The evidence supporting McCullough's guilt was not the kind of modern forensic evidence that could simply be placed into a laboratory machine and produce an unquestionable result. There was no DNA match connecting him to Maria. There was no physical evidence recovered from the crime scene that definitively identified him. The case depended heavily on testimony and interpretation, and the old records concerning his whereabouts remained significant. As the legal proceedings continued, questions surrounding those records became more important. The defense pursued further review, arguing that evidence supporting McCullough's alibi had not been properly considered and that the identification evidence was unreliable. The case moved into another phase, one in which the conviction itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Suddenly, the story was no longer simply about a child murdered in 1957. It was about whether the justice system had finally found the correct killer or had created another answer from the fragments of an ancient mystery. The possibility was deeply unsettling. For more than 50 years, investigators had wanted one thing: a name. Now they had one. But a name was not necessarily the truth. The conviction had given the community something it had not possessed since Maria disappeared: certainty. Yet certainty built on fragile evidence can collapse with extraordinary speed, and as the old records were examined again, cracks began to appear. The man once cleared by the FBI was now challenging the conviction that had placed him in prison. The telephone record from Rockford remained. The military recruitment encounter remained. The original investigation remained, and Kathy Sigmund's childhood memory remained at the center of the dispute. The question became whether the later identification could overcome the evidence that had led investigators to clear Tessier in the first place. Maria's family had waited more than 50 years for an answer, and now they faced another painful possibility. What if the answer was wrong again? What if the mystery had not been solved at all? The case that had begun with a little girl standing beneath a streetlight had now become a battle over memory, evidence, and the limits of justice. And somewhere behind every argument was Maria herself, still 7 years old in the photographs, still frozen in time, while the adults around her argued about what had happened. The years had changed everything except the central fact: Maria Ridulph had disappeared. Her life had been taken. Her killer had never been conclusively established. And even after a court declared that Jack McCullough was responsible, the evidence was not finished speaking. The conviction of Jack McCullough seemed, at first, to provide the ending that the Maria Ridulph case had been denied for generations. But the moment the verdict was announced, another question began to emerge from the shadows. Was the evidence strong enough to withstand the passage of more than 50 years? The case had finally produced a legal answer, yet the circumstances surrounding that answer were unusual from the beginning. There was no DNA evidence tying McCullough to Maria. There was no physical object recovered from the crime scene that suddenly revealed his identity. There was no confession from McCullough admitting that he had taken Maria. Instead, the prosecution depended heavily on a combination of testimony, historical records, and a theory that the young man known as Johnny had been the same person who later became Jack McCullough. That theory had convinced the court, but conviction did not end the questions. It intensified them. The defense continued challenging the evidence, focusing particularly on McCullough's whereabouts on the night Maria disappeared, and the reliability of the identification made decades later by Kathy Sigmund. The old records became increasingly important because they had been created close to the time of the crime, before decades of memory, discussion, and publicity could alter anyone's recollection. One of the most significant records was the telephone call from Rockford to the Tessier family home. The call had been made at approximately 6:57 on the evening Maria disappeared. It was a collect call. That meant there was a record of Tessier being in contact with his family from Rockford during a period when Maria was still at Sycamore. Investigators in 1957 had considered this evidence. They had not simply accepted Tessier's story without checking. They had questioned him. They had questioned his parents. They had investigated his movements. They had given him a polygraph examination. And ultimately, the FBI had cleared him. That historical conclusion did not automatically prove that Tessier was innocent, but it mattered because the later prosecution had to explain why the earlier investigation had been wrong. The defense argued that the evidence supporting Tessier's alibi was stronger than the evidence supporting the later identification. The case was now becoming a contest between what had been documented in 1957 and what had been remembered more than 5 decades later. The difference was enormous. A telephone record does not remember. A military recruitment officer does not remember in the same way a child does. A document created at the time of an event does not change because decades have passed. Human memory can be vivid, emotional, and sincere, but it can also be reconstructed. The defense therefore focused on whether Kathy's later identification had been influenced by information she had encountered over the years. The prosecution maintained that her memory was genuine. She had been there. She had seen the man. She had remembered the encounter. And when she later identified McCullough, she believed she was identifying the same person. But the legal question was more complicated than sincerity. The question was accuracy. Could a person accurately identify someone they had seen briefly as a child more than 50 years earlier? The case became an extraordinary examination of that problem. Kathy had been only 8 years old when Maria disappeared. She had not expected to become a central witness in a murder trial decades later. Her childhood had continued. She had grown up. She had built a life. Yet the memory of Maria and Johnny remained. The image of the young man had become part of the story she carried with her. When investigators returned to the case decades later, they brought new information with them. They knew that the man they suspected was McCullough. They knew the allegations surrounding him. They knew the history of the case. That context created the possibility that old memories could be affected by new information. The defense argued that this possibility was too significant to ignore. The prosecution argued that Kathy's recollection remained credible despite the passage of time. The judge ultimately accepted the prosecution's case and convicted McCullough. But the legal battle did not end. Instead, the conviction entered a new stage as McCullough's attorneys pursued appeals and challenged the evidence. One of the strongest arguments involved evidence related to his alibi. The defense maintained that the original investigation had overlooked or misunderstood evidence that placed him in Rockford. The old telephone record was particularly important. If Tessier was in Rockford when Maria was abducted, then the prosecution's theory became much more difficult to sustain. The defense also pointed to the encounter with military recruiters at the Rockford post office. These were not memories created decades later. They were pieces of information connected to the original investigation. They had existed long before McCullough was accused. The legal system, therefore, had to decide whether those old facts deserved more weight than the later identification. The case was no longer simply about what someone remembered. It was about what the records could prove. The distinction became increasingly important as the appellate process continued. McCullough's attorneys argued that he had been wrongly convicted. Prosecutors eventually acknowledged that the conviction could not stand. In April 2016, an Illinois judge vacated McCullough's conviction and ordered a new trial. That decision was a dramatic reversal. The man who had been convicted as Maria's killer was no longer legally convicted. The supposed solution to the 50-year mystery had begun to collapse. But the collapse did not immediately identify another suspect. Instead, it reopened the void that had existed since 1957. The prosecution then moved to dismiss the charge. Without a viable case against McCullough, the state could not continue pursuing the conviction. The charges were ultimately dismissed. In 2017, McCullough received a certificate of innocence. The legal system had now made a remarkable journey. It had first cleared him in 1957. More than 50 years later, it had convicted him. Then, after another review of the evidence, it had vacated the conviction and formally recognized his innocence. The same man had moved through the justice system from suspect to cleared individual, from cleared individual to convicted murderer, and from convicted murderer to legally innocent man. Few cold cases demonstrate the danger of uncertainty as dramatically. Yet the most important consequence was what the reversal meant for Maria's case. The murder was not solved. The killer was still unidentified. The mystery remained open. For Maria's family, the result was devastating. They had waited decades for justice. They had watched a man be convicted. They had believed that the person responsible had finally been identified. Then that conclusion disappeared. The legal system had given them an answer and then taken it away. The emotional impact of that reversal cannot be measured by court documents alone. A family that had lived with uncertainty for more than 50 years had to confront it again. The name that had been attached to Maria's death was no longer legally valid. The case returned to the same unanswered question. Who was Johnny? What happened to Maria after she left the street? Who transported her to the wooded area where her body was found? And why did the killer remain unidentified after so much time? The answers were still buried somewhere in the evidence. The case also raised a broader issue about the nature of cold case investigation. When investigators reopen a decades-old crime, they are not simply picking up where earlier detectives stopped. They are entering a different world. The witnesses are older. The records may have been lost or altered. The people involved may have died. Technology has changed. Public understanding has changed. And perhaps most importantly, the original theories can influence the way new evidence is interpreted. A cold case investigator must therefore walk a dangerous line. They must remain open to new possibilities without allowing a desired conclusion to shape the evidence. The Maria Ridulph investigation demonstrated how easily the search for closure can become a search for confirmation. Once investigators believed McCullough could be Johnny, evidence was viewed through that possibility. The later legal proceedings showed why every piece of evidence had to be examined independently. The telephone record mattered. The military recruitment encounter mattered. The original FBI clearance mattered. The limitations of a decades-old identification mattered. The absence of physical evidence linking McCullough to the crime mattered. None of these details could simply be ignored because a conviction had already been obtained. That was one reason the case remained so controversial. It was not simply a story about a killer escaping justice. It was a story about the uncertainty created when a murder has no definitive physical link to a suspect. The original crime scene offered limited forensic opportunities. Maria had been missing for months before her body was found. The location where she was discovered was far from Sycamore. The passage of time had destroyed or weakened potential evidence. The investigation therefore depended heavily on people and memory. But people are not evidence in the same way that DNA is evidence. Their recollections can be honest and still imperfect. Their perceptions can be shaped by fear. Their memories can change without the person realizing it. And the longer the interval between an event and an identification, the more difficult it becomes to determine where memory ends and reconstruction begins. That was particularly troubling in a case where the original witness had been a child. Kathy had not been an adult trained to observe faces. She had been an 8-year-old playing outside. Her attention was focused on Maria and the interaction with Johnny, not on creating a precise description for police officers. She could not have known that the face she saw would become important more than 50 years later. Her memory was never created for a courtroom. It was simply a childhood memory of an unusual encounter. The fact that it survived for so long made it emotionally powerful. But survival does not necessarily mean accuracy. This distinction became central to the arguments surrounding McCullough's conviction. The legal system eventually concluded that the evidence did not justify keeping him imprisoned for Maria's murder. The certificate of innocence went beyond simply vacating the conviction. It represented an official recognition that McCullough had been wrongfully convicted. That development changed the meaning of the entire case. The story could no longer be presented simply as a cold case solved after 50 years. The more accurate description was far more unsettling. Maria Ridulph's murder remained unresolved, while a man who had once been convicted of killing her was officially cleared. The search for the real killer therefore remained alive, and because the case was so old, every remaining clue carried extraordinary importance. The name Johnny still mattered. The original description still mattered. The location where Maria was last seen still mattered. The path from Sycamore to Woodbine still mattered. The people who were near the neighborhood that night still mattered. And perhaps most importantly, the original record still mattered. The case had taught investigators that old evidence could not simply be discarded because it had failed to produce an answer decades earlier. Sometimes the answer is hidden not in a new discovery, but in a detail that was misunderstood the first time. The challenge was to determine which details were genuine clues and which were false trails created by memory, assumption, or coincidence. More than 50 years after Maria vanished, that distinction remained unresolved. The community had endured one of the longest periods of uncertainty imaginable. Maria had been 7 years old in 1957. By the time McCullough was cleared, generations had passed. People who had been children when she disappeared were now elderly. The streets had changed. The world had changed. But the photograph of Maria still showed the same little girl. Her life remained frozen at 7. The people investigating her death had grown old, but Maria never had the opportunity to do so. That was why the case refused to disappear. It was not simply an unsolved murder in an old file. It was the unfinished story of a child whose future had been taken from her. And as the conviction against McCullough collapsed, the case once again became what it had been for most of its history. A mystery without a confirmed killer. The name Johnny remained. The unanswered questions remained. And somewhere in the distance between a quiet Sycamore Street and a wooded area near Woodbine, the truth remained hidden. The collapse of Jack McCullough's conviction changed the Maria Ridulph investigation in a way that no earlier development had for years. The case had been presented as a mystery that finally received an answer. Now the answer itself had been discredited, and investigators were forced to confront the possibility that the most important question had never truly been answered. Who was the man who called himself Johnny? The question sounded almost deceptively simple, but behind it stood decades of evidence, memories, records, and conflicting interpretations. Maria had disappeared in minutes. Her body had been discovered months later. More than 50 years had passed before an arrest was made. Then, only a few years later, that conviction collapsed. The story had moved in a circle, returning investigators to the same dark point where it had begun. Yet the reopening of the case also revealed how much information had accumulated around Maria's disappearance. Some evidence came from the original 1957 investigation. Some emerged decades later. Some supported McCullough, some had been used against him, and some raised questions that had never received satisfactory answers. The original description of Johnny remained one of the most important clues. Kathy Sigmund had described a young man who had approached the girls. He was not a mysterious figure created by later investigators. He had been there that evening, according to her account, and he had interacted directly with Maria. That meant the investigation was not searching for a completely unknown person. It was searching for someone who had been physically present in the neighborhood and who had somehow convinced two children that his presence was ordinary enough to accept. That detail mattered. Whoever Johnny was, he had apparently been able to approach Maria without immediately alarming her. He was not described as someone who had forced his way into the neighborhood. He was someone who appeared comfortable enough to speak with children on a residential street. That made the disappearance especially disturbing. Maria had not vanished from a locked room. She had vanished from a place where she believed she was safe. The investigation, therefore, depended heavily on reconstructing the interaction between the children and the stranger. What exactly did he say? How long did he stay? Did he know Maria? Had he seen her before? Was he truly a stranger? Or was Johnny a name invented to make the encounter feel less threatening? These questions could not be answered with certainty, but they shaped the search. Investigators considered people who had connections to Sycamore and people who were simply passing through. The FBI examined a large number of possible suspects, yet no one could be definitively connected to the crime. The absence of a clear forensic trail made the investigation extremely difficult. Maria's body was not found until April 1958. By then, nearly 5 months had passed. Any evidence that might have existed on her clothing, on her body, or at the location where she disappeared had been exposed to weather and time. Investigators were working with a crime scene that had already been transformed by nature. The location where Maria was found also created another mystery. She had disappeared in Sycamore, yet her remains were discovered near Woodbine, far away. Whoever had taken her had either transported her or somehow brought her to that area. The distance made the crime more complicated. It raised questions about transportation, opportunity, and motive. Did the killer know the area where Maria was found? Was the location selected deliberately? Was it simply somewhere the killer happened to know? Was Maria taken there immediately, or was she held somewhere else first? There were no definitive answers. The investigation had to live with uncertainty. Over the decades, theories multiplied. But theories are not solutions. A cold case can accumulate dozens of possible explanations while still lacking one fact that proves which explanation is correct. That was the central problem in Maria's case. The investigation had many pieces, but no complete picture. Then there was the question of John Tessier, later known as Jack McCullough. His story became increasingly complicated because he occupied two completely different roles in the history of the case. In 1957, he was a young man, questioned and cleared by investigators. Decades later, he became the central suspect and was convicted. The contrast between those two moments was extraordinary. The original FBI investigation had not been casual. Agents questioned him. His family was interviewed. His movements were examined. He took a polygraph. Evidence connected him to Rockford. He was eventually cleared, yet more than half a century later, the case returned to his name. That reversal forced investigators and courts to examine not only whether McCullough was guilty, but whether the original investigation had somehow missed something. The later conviction suggested that it had. The later exoneration suggested that perhaps it had not. The legal history itself became part of the mystery. When the conviction was vacated and the charges dismissed, the court system effectively acknowledged that the evidence was insufficient to maintain the accusation. The certificate of innocence added another layer, formally recognizing that McCullough had been wrongfully convicted. But clearing McCullough did not clear the mystery. It simply removed one answer. The real killer remained unknown. For Maria's family, that meant another painful chapter of uncertainty. The passage of time had already taken so much from them. Now the possibility of closure had vanished again. The case returned to the question it had carried for decades. And because so much time had passed, the search for new evidence became extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses who might have seen something in 1957 were no longer available. People who had been interviewed as children might not remember the same details. Some potential suspects were dead. Records could be incomplete. The investigation faced an enemy more powerful than any individual suspect: time itself. Yet time also created one unexpected advantage. The original investigation had generated documents. Reports had been written. Telephone calls had been recorded. Names had been documented. Interviews had been preserved. Those records offered a snapshot of what investigators knew before later theories changed the story. In a modern cold case, those original records can be invaluable because they show what witnesses said before they had decades to reflect on the event. They allow investigators to compare early statements with later ones. In Maria's case, those comparisons became especially important. The original description of Johnny could be examined against the later identification of McCullough. Did the descriptions match? Did they differ? Had the witness's memory changed? These questions were not simply academic. They went directly to the reliability of the conviction. The case demonstrated how a witness statement can evolve. A child might describe a person in broad terms at the time, then later provide a more specific description after hearing names, seeing photographs, or discussing the case. That does not necessarily mean the witness is lying. It means memory is complicated. Human beings naturally reconstruct experiences. Each retelling can reinforce certain details while allowing others to disappear. In a murder case, that process can have enormous consequences. The justice system must decide whether the memory is sufficiently reliable to deprive someone of freedom. In McCullough's case, the later court proceedings concluded that the evidence was not enough to sustain the conviction. The case, therefore, became a cautionary example of the danger of relying heavily on a decades-old identification without independent physical evidence. The most haunting aspect was that the original investigation had contained a competing story all along. Tessier's Rockford alibi was not invented after the conviction. It had existed in 1957. The telephone record was not a modern fabrication. It was created at the time. The military recruitment encounter was not a memory developed decades later. It was part of the historical record. These details had been considered when the FBI cleared tests. Their existence meant that the later prosecution was never simply a fresh discovery. It was a reinterpretation of a person who had already been investigated. That raised another question. Why had the later investigation focused so heavily on him? The answer lay partly in the family allegation that emerged decades later. A deathbed statement was reported, and that statement pointed toward McCullough. But a deathbed statement is itself a form of hearsay when the person who allegedly made it is no longer alive to explain it. Investigators, therefore, had to determine what had actually been said, who heard it, under what circumstances, and whether the information could be independently confirmed. Such evidence can be powerful, but it can also be vulnerable to misunderstanding. By the time the case was reopened, the original events were already more than 50 years old. Every new claim had to be evaluated against the possibility of memory distortion. Yet the accusation was enough to reopen one of America's oldest murder mysteries. Investigators returned to Sycamore. They reviewed old records. They questioned surviving witnesses. They looked at the movements of McCullough and other possible suspects. The case that had once seemed frozen in the 1950s suddenly became active again. For Maria's family, this created a mixture of hope and hope because the investigation might finally identify the killer, fear because the wrong person might once again be blamed. That fear was not theoretical. It had already happened. McCullough had been convicted and later declared innocent. The case had demonstrated how devastating an incorrect conclusion could be. If investigators were going to reopen the search, they needed more than a compelling story. They needed evidence that could survive scrutiny. But what kind of evidence could still exist after more than 50 years? Perhaps a document, perhaps an overlooked witness, perhaps a forgotten connection, perhaps something in the original case file that had been dismissed because investigators did not understand its importance at the time. The search, therefore, became a race against history. Every remaining record was a potential clue. Every surviving witness was a potential source of information. Every inconsistency was worth examining. Yet the further investigators went, the more the case seemed to reveal the same problem that had existed from the beginning. There was a child who had vanished. There was a young stranger who had approached her. There was a body discovered months later. There were suspects, but no definitive physical evidence identifying the killer. The case was full of stories, but short on certainty. And somewhere inside that uncertainty was the truth. The challenge was finding it without creating another false answer. More than 50 years after Maria disappeared, the town of Sycamore still carried the memory of that December night. The street where children had once played had become part of local history. Maria's name remained familiar. The case remained one of the community's deepest wounds. But the mystery persisted. The man called Johnny had never been conclusively identified. The conviction of Jack McCullough had failed. The certificate of innocence had removed him from the list of legally responsible people, and the real killer was still somewhere beyond the reach of the evidence. That was the cruel reality facing investigators. They were not simply trying to solve an old murder. They were trying to recover the truth from a past that had been distorted by time. Every new lead carried the possibility of breakthrough. Every new theory carried the possibility of another mistake, and Maria's case demanded something more difficult than an arrest. It demanded certainty. Until that certainty could be found, the little girl who disappeared on a December evening would remain at the center of a mystery that refused to die. The Maria Ridulph investigation had now entered the most dangerous stage of any cold case. The stage where the desire for an answer could become almost as powerful as the evidence itself. More than half a century had passed since Maria disappeared, and every surviving clue had acquired extraordinary importance. The community wanted a name. The family wanted justice. Investigators wanted resolution. But the collapse of Jack McCullough's conviction had demonstrated a painful truth. A case can appear solved and still be wrong. That realization forced investigators to return to the beginning, back to the winter evening when Maria and Kathy were standing outside in Sycamore, back to the young man who called himself Johnny, and back to the few minutes that separated an ordinary childhood game from a tragedy that would change the town forever. The original investigation had generated hundreds of interviews and a vast collection of reports. The FBI became deeply involved after Maria disappeared, and agents considered a wide range of possibilities. They searched for people who might have been traveling through the area. They questioned local residents. They examined individuals with criminal backgrounds. They looked for anyone who matched the description of the young man seen with Maria. But the investigation had one major weakness. The witness who had seen Johnny was a child. Kathy could provide information, but investigators could not expect her to possess the observational precision of an adult trained to identify strangers. She had experienced the encounter as a moment of childhood curiosity, not as a life-defining observation. She had no reason to memorize the man's face. She had no reason to imagine that decades later, lawyers would debate every feature of the person she remembered. Yet that brief encounter became the foundation upon which later theories were constructed. When Maria vanished, the search began almost immediately. Residents moved through Sycamore looking for her. Her parents were desperate for information. The possibility that she had been abducted quickly became the dominant concern. Investigators wanted to know whether someone had approached the girls intentionally or whether the stranger had simply appeared by chance. They wanted to know whether Maria knew him. They wanted to know why she would have gone with him. And they wanted to know whether Kathy had seen the entire interaction. Each question had another question behind it. The search continued into the night and beyond. Maria's disappearance quickly became national news. The FBI's involvement demonstrated how seriously authorities viewed the possibility of an abduction. Federal agents established operations in Sycamore, and the case attracted attention from the highest levels of government. President Dwight Eisenhower reportedly followed the investigation, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received information about the case. Newspapers published descriptions of Maria and appeals for assistance. The community searched, waited, and hoped. But no rescue came. Months passed. Then the discovery of Maria's remains changed the emotional landscape completely. On April 26, 1958, two people searching for mushrooms near Woodbine found the body of a child beneath a partially fallen tree. The remains were later identified as Maria. The location was far from the neighborhood where she disappeared. That distance created another mystery. Whoever had taken Maria had somehow moved her from Sycamore to the wooded area. There was no clear public explanation of how that had happened. The killer had successfully hidden her for months. The discovery also meant that investigators were now working backward from a body that had been exposed to the elements. The physical evidence was limited. Modern forensic science did not yet exist in the form investigators have today. There was no advanced DNA analysis. There was no genealogical database. There were no sophisticated digital records to reconstruct movements. The investigation had to depend on witness statements, historical documents, and traditional police work. That environment made it extremely difficult to identify the killer. One of the young men examined was John Tessier. He lived in Sycamore and was 18 years old. His age and general appearance made him a person investigators considered. But the evidence did not support the accusation. Tessier said he had been in Rockford. The telephone record supported part of his account. The FBI investigated further and found evidence that he had been at the Rockford post office later that evening. He also took a polygraph examination and passed it. Investigators eventually cleared him. Tessier left the area and entered military training. His life moved forward. The Maria Ridulph case did not. It remained open, unresolved, and increasingly distant. For decades, Tessier's connection to the case was essentially a historical footnote. Then time turned the story upside down. The man who had once been cleared became the man who would eventually be convicted. The transformation began with an allegation involving a relative and a reported deathbed statement. The information suggested that McCullough had been involved in Maria's disappearance. Investigators took the claim seriously enough to reopen the case. The passage of time made the new investigation extraordinary. It also made it dangerous. A deathbed statement can be emotionally powerful, especially in a cold case where investigators have almost nothing. But it still must be examined carefully. Who heard it? When was it made? What exactly was said? Was it a direct admission or an interpretation? Could the information be independently confirmed? These questions became essential because the accusation against McCullough was not accompanied by a modern forensic breakthrough. There was no newly discovered DNA profile identifying him. There was no hidden confession recorded on tape. Instead, the investigation relied heavily on testimony and the reinterpretation of historical evidence. That was enough to bring the case to trial. Kathy Sigmund, now an adult, became a central witness again. Her memories of the evening had survived for more than 50 years. She identified McCullough as the man she believed she had seen with Maria. The identification was emotionally powerful. She had been the last known person with Maria before the child disappeared. Her testimony gave the prosecution a direct connection between McCullough and the final moments of Maria's known life. But the defense argued that the identification could not be considered reliable after such an extraordinary passage of time. More than 50 years separated the event from the later identification. Kathy had been 8 years old when she saw Johnny. She had spent her entire life carrying the memory of that night. Over the decades, she had inevitably encountered information about the case. The defense argued that those later experiences could have influenced her memory without her realizing it. This is one of the most difficult problems in eyewitness evidence. A witness does not have to be dishonest for a memory to become inaccurate. The human brain reconstructs experiences. It fills gaps. It strengthens certain details and loses others. When a person repeatedly hears the same name connected to an event, that association can become woven into memory. In a case as famous as Maria's, the risk was even greater. The identity of McCullough was no longer simply an unknown possibility. It had become the focus of an investigation. Kathy knew who investigators suspected. She knew the story that had developed around him. The question was whether her identification came from an independent memory or from a memory that had been reconstructed over time. The court ultimately accepted the prosecution's argument, and McCullough was convicted in 2012. The sentence was life imprisonment. The announcement appeared to bring the long mystery to an end. Maria had a killer. Her family had an answer. The community could finally believe that justice had been served, but the evidence continued to resist certainty. The defense returned to the old alibi, the telephone record from Rockford, the military recruitment encounter, the original FBI investigation. These details had not disappeared. They remained in the historical record. The defense argued that they showed McCullough could not have committed the crime as the prosecution claimed. The case became a conflict between evidence created in 1957 and testimony developed more than 50 years later. As the appeals progressed, the old evidence became increasingly significant. Investigators and lawyers revisited the timeline. When exactly had Maria been last seen? When could she have been abducted? Where was Tessier during those critical minutes? Could he have traveled from Rockford to Sycamore and returned in time to make the recorded call? These questions required precise reconstruction. A few minutes could change everything. A telephone call at 6:57 was not simply a historical curiosity, it was a potential marker in the timeline. The military recruitment encounter later that evening was another marker. If Tessier was physically present in Rockford during periods when Maria was believed to be in Sycamore, then the prosecution needed a convincing explanation. The defense maintained that there was none. The original FBI investigation had reached the same basic conclusion. Tessier was not responsible, yet the later prosecution had asked the court to reject that conclusion based largely on evidence that had emerged decades later. The legal system now had to decide whether the new theory was stronger than the old evidence. In 2016, the answer became clear. An Illinois judge vacated McCullough's conviction and ordered a new trial. The decision represented a dramatic acknowledgement that the original conviction could not safely stand. Prosecutors then moved to dismiss the charges. The case against McCullough collapsed. In 2017, he received a certificate of innocence. The man who had once been called Maria's killer was officially recognized as innocent. The development was shocking because it meant that the apparent solution to the case had disappeared. The community was left with an even more disturbing reality than before. Maria had still been murdered. Her killer was still free or unidentified, and the man convicted of the crime had spent years in prison for something the legal system ultimately concluded he had not done. The case became a warning about the difference between solving a mystery and proving a crime. A compelling narrative can connect a suspect to a victim. A witness can sincerely believe an identification. A family allegation can appear convincing, but when the evidence is tested, the narrative must survive every contradiction. In Maria's case, it did not. The old records were powerful enough to undermine the conviction. The certificate of innocence made the reversal official. But there was another consequence. The failure of the conviction forced investigators to reconsider all the other people who had been examined in the original investigation. If McCullough was not the killer, then Johnny remained unidentified. The original description once again became important. The investigators had to ask whether the man described by Kathy had ever been correctly identified. Perhaps he had. Perhaps he had not. Perhaps the killer had been questioned and released. Perhaps he had never been questioned at all. The possibilities were endless. The passage of time had made the search harder, but it had not made the mystery less important. Maria's name still carried the weight of a child whose life ended before she had the chance to grow up. Her case still represented a profound failure of justice, and the fact that an innocent man had been imprisoned made the need for caution even greater. Any future investigation would have to avoid the mistakes of the past. It would have to separate evidence from assumption. It would have to distinguish memory from fact. It would have to examine old records without allowing the desire for closure to determine the conclusion. The question was no longer simply who looked like John. It was who could be connected to Maria through evidence that could survive decades of scrutiny. That was the challenge facing anyone who dared to reopen the mystery again. And somewhere inside the old files, the answer might still exist. Maybe it was hidden in an interview that had been dismissed. Maybe it was contained in a forgotten timeline. Maybe it was buried beneath a name investigators had once considered and rejected. Or maybe the killer had died decades earlier, carrying the truth with him. Maria's case had survived because the question had never gone away. More than 50 years had passed, but the night of December 3rd remained frozen in the record. A little girl, a friend, a stranger, a name, Johnny. Then silent, and after all the investigations, all the searches, all the courtrooms, and all the years, the identity of the person who took Maria remained beyond certainty. The case had not ended. It had simply entered another chapter of uncertainty, with the most important clue still waiting somewhere in the past. The years after Jack McCullough's exoneration left the Maria Ridolph case in an uncomfortable place. There was no longer a convicted killer to point to, no courtroom verdict to provide a sense of finality, and no single suspect whose name could be treated as the definitive answer. There was only Maria, the evidence, and an unanswered question that had survived for generations. For investigators, the challenge was enormous. The original crime had happened in 1957. The body had been found in 1958. The first major investigation had already searched through countless possibilities. Then, decades later, a second investigation had produced a conviction that ultimately collapsed. Any new examination had to begin with humility. It had to accept that earlier investigators, despite their efforts, could have missed something. It also had to accept that later investigators could have been misled by evidence that appeared stronger than it really was. The case demanded a fresh look at everything. The most important place to begin was the last known moment of Maria's life. She was outside with Kathy Sigmund on a winter evening in Sycamore. The neighborhood was familiar. The girls were playing. Then Johnny appeared. That encounter was the hinge upon which the entire mystery turned. If Johnny was the killer, then identifying him could potentially solve the case. If Johnny was not the killer, then the investigation had been following the wrong path from the beginning. But the identity of Johnny was complicated by the fact that the name itself came from the child witness. Kathy remembered the young man as Johnny. That could have been his real name, a nickname, or simply a name he gave the girl. There was no guarantee that it was connected to his actual identity. A stranger could invent a name easily. In a case involving children, a false name would be an effective way to conceal identity. The question was whether Johnny had approached Maria deliberately or whether the encounter had been accidental. The answer mattered because it could reveal something about motive. If he had been watching Maria, then the disappearance may have been planned. If he had encountered the girls by chance, then the crime may have developed suddenly. But investigators never obtained a definitive explanation. The uncertainty became even greater when Maria's body was found in a wooded area near Woodbine. The distance from Sycamore raised practical questions. How had she been transported? By car? By another vehicle? Had the killer been familiar with the roads? Had Maria been taken there immediately, or had the killer moved her later? The surviving evidence did not provide a complete timeline. Without that timeline, investigators could not easily determine what kind of opportunity the killer had required. The wooded location itself was significant. It was remote enough for a body to remain undiscovered for months. The fact that Maria was found beneath a partially fallen tree suggested that whoever left her there had chosen a place where she would be. Difficult to find. Whether that choice was deliberate or simply convenient remained unknown. The discovery ended the search for a missing child, but it opened the far more difficult task of identifying a murderer. In 1958, investigators did not have the tools available to modern cold case teams. The science of forensic genetics was decades away. There were no national DNA databases. Investigators could not upload a biological profile and wait for a distant relative to produce a match. Fingerprint databases were far less comprehensive than they would later become. Surveillance footage was non-existent. Digital evidence did not exist. The case was dependent on traditional investigative methods. That meant talking to people, following physical leads, checking alibis, searching records, looking for inconsistencies, and hoping someone would remember something important. But every year that passed weakened those possibilities. People moved. People died. Memories faded. Buildings changed. Roads changed. Records were lost. The world around the case continued moving while Maria's story remained frozen. Yet the mystery never completely disappeared. Her family continued to remember her. The community continued to associate her name with the unresolved crime. Journalists returned to the case. Investigators occasionally revisited the evidence. Each renewed effort brought a possibility of a breakthrough, but each also carried the risk of repeating old assumptions. One of the most important lessons from McCullough's wrongful conviction was that a compelling theory could become dangerous if investigators stopped challenging it. Once a suspect becomes the center of an investigation, every piece of evidence can begin to look like confirmation. Details that support the theory appear important. Details that contradict it may be dismissed as mistake. That process can happen gradually and without deliberate misconduct. It is a human tendency. Cold case investigations are particularly vulnerable because investigators desperately want to turn uncertainty into certainty. Maria's case showed exactly how difficult that can be. The deathbed allegation that pointed toward McCullough had created a new direction. The later identification by Kathy appeared to reinforce it. The pieces seemed to fit, but the old alibi evidence did not disappear. When the courts examined the entire picture, the conviction could not survive. That meant any future investigation had to treat the original records as more than historical background. They were evidence. The telephone call from Rockford remained an important part of the timeline. So did the military recruitment encounter. The FBI's original clearance remained significant, and the fact that McCullough had passed a polygraph while not proof of innocence demonstrated that investigators in 1957 had actively considered him rather than simply overlooking him. The case therefore became a study in contradiction. The same person could appear suspicious under one interpretation and strongly supported by an alibi under another. The difference depended on which evidence was given the most weight. That was why the case could not simply be solved by choosing the most compelling story. It required evidence capable of resolving the contradiction. Another problem was the passage of time. When the case was reopened decades later, many of the people who might have provided useful information were elderly. Some had died. Others could no longer remember details with confidence. Even witnesses who were alive had to reconstruct events from childhood or early adulthood. The investigators were not questioning people about what they had seen last week. They were asking them to remember a night that had happened before many of them had even reached adulthood. That limitation applied to both witnesses and suspects. A person could sincerely remember being somewhere, but without records, there might be no way to verify it. Conversely, a person could forget a minor encounter that later became crucial. The passage of time transformed ordinary events into potential evidence. A person who had spoken to a stranger on the street in 1957 might not have remembered it for decades. But if that stranger later became a murder suspect, the forgotten encounter could become enormously important. This was the challenge facing investigators. They had to distinguish genuine memory from reconstructed memory and meaningful coincidence from irrelevant detail. The search also required examining people who had not previously been considered serious suspects. The original investigation had generated a long list of names, but not every name had received the same level of attention. Some people may have been ruled out quickly because of limited evidence. Others may have disappeared from investigators' attention when the trail went cold. In a modern review, each of those decisions could be examined again. Why was a person cleared? What evidence supported the clearance? Was the evidence reliable? Was there a witness? Was there an alibi? Did investigators ever verify it? These questions might reveal something that had been overlooked. But there was no guarantee that a new investigation would produce an answer. Cold cases can remain unsolved even after every reasonable avenue has been explored. Some crimes simply leave too little evidence behind. Maria's case was especially difficult because the killer had managed to remove the victim from the original scene and conceal her body for months. The absence of physical evidence was devastating. There was no obvious forensic trail leading directly to a suspect. The crime scene where Maria disappeared was an ordinary residential street. Hundreds of people may have lived nearby or passed through the area. A stranger could have entered and left without being noticed. The investigation had to reconstruct movements that nobody had recorded. It was almost like trying to rebuild a film from a handful of still photographs. The photographs existed, but the crucial moments between them were missing. One image was Maria alive. Another was Maria's body months later. Between those points was the entire mystery. The more investigators examined the case, the more they realized how little they truly knew about those missing hours. Where exactly did Maria go after she left the street? Was she taken immediately? Did she resist? Did she trust Johnny? Was she told she was going somewhere harmless? Did the killer use a vehicle? If so, what kind? Was there a witness who saw something but never understood its significance? Each possibility created another branch in the investigation, and every branch led into the same darkness. The lack of certainty did not mean there were no clues. It meant the clues were incomplete. A cold case is rarely a blank page. It is more often a page covered with fragments. The challenge is connecting those fragments without forcing them together. Maria's case had many fragments. The name Johnny, the eyewitness memory, the winter evening, the disappearance, the doll, the search, the body found near Woodbine, the original suspects, the FBI investigation, the later accusation, the conviction, the exoneration. Each fragment had meaning, but not necessarily the meaning people first assumed. That was why the case continued to attract investigators and historians. It was not only a murder mystery, it was a study of how truth can become obscured when time, memory, and human interpretation interact. For Maria's family, however, those were not abstract questions. The case was about a child they loved. The legal reversals did not change the fact that Maria was gone. They did not restore the years that had been lost. They did not identify the person responsible, and they did not erase the pain of knowing that the case had once appeared solved before being reopened again. The most difficult part was that Maria could not speak for herself. The only voice from the night she disappeared came through Kathy, a child who had been standing beside her. That voice had carried the investigation for decades, but investigators now understood that it had to be handled with extraordinary care. The truth could not be created simply because everyone wanted one. It had to be discovered. Somewhere in the old evidence, there might still be a clue capable of changing everything. Perhaps the key was hidden in the timeline. Perhaps it was in a forgotten interview. Perhaps it was in the identity of someone who had been near the girls that evening. Perhaps the killer had been living under an ordinary name all along. The case remained open in the historical sense, but the trail was cold, and as another generation grew up knowing Maria's name, one haunting thought remained. If the answer had been hidden for more than 50 years, how much longer could it remain buried? The streets of Sycamore had changed, but the question had not. Maria Ridulph walked outside one December evening and never came home. Someone knew what happened to her. Someone had carried that knowledge for years, and somewhere, beneath decades of silence, the truth was still waiting. By the time the Maria Ridulph case had passed into another generation, the original December evening seemed almost impossibly distant. Yet, the central mystery remained remarkably simple. A little girl had gone outside to play. A stranger had appeared. Her friend had seen him. Maria had disappeared. Months later, her body was discovered in a wooded area. Everything that came afterward was an attempt to explain those few missing hours. But every attempt seemed to create another question. The conviction of Jack McCullough had briefly offered the appearance of certainty, only for that certainty to collapse. His exoneration forced investigators, prosecutors, and the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. The most famous suspect in the case was no longer legally responsible, and the true identity of the person who killed Maria remained unknown. That meant the old evidence had to be viewed without the convenience of a predetermined suspect. The name Johnny once again became the center of the investigation. He was the man Kathy remembered. He was the figure who had entered the children's world for only a short time and then disappeared into history. But who was he really? The answer had never been established beyond doubt. Kathy's original description had helped investigators search for him in 1957, but the description itself was not enough to produce a definitive identification. That was one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Investigators had a living witness to the encounter, yet they did not have a confirmed name. They had a body, yet they did not have a confirmed killer. They had suspects, yet none could be conclusively tied to the crime. The investigation contained all the ingredients of a solution except the one element that mattered most. In the months following Maria's disappearance, authorities searched widely. The FBI became involved. Investigators pursued leads across Illinois and beyond. The case was important enough to receive national attention, and the disappearance of a child created fear throughout communities far beyond Sycamore. Parents became more cautious. Strangers attracted suspicion. The idea that someone could approach a child on an ordinary neighborhood street and make her disappear was deeply frightening. Yet, despite the scale of the search, no decisive breakthrough came. Then Maria's remains were found near Woodbine in April 1958. The discovery gave investigators a location, but not an explanation. The wooded area was far from where Maria had last been seen. The killer had succeeded in separating the body from the original crime scene. That separation created a second layer of uncertainty. The investigators now had to understand not only what happened on the street in Sycamore, but how Maria had been transported to the location where she was eventually discovered. The physical distance suggested that the person responsible had some means of transportation or some opportunity to move her. But the evidence did not reveal exactly how. No definitive vehicle was established as the murder vehicle. No confirmed witness emerged to describe Maria being transported. No piece of physical evidence conclusively linked the wooded location to a particular person. The investigation therefore remained dependent on human testimony and circumstantial evidence. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that the crime had occurred during winter. Weather could erase traces, time could destroy evidence, and the longer investigators searched, the more difficult it became to separate what people actually remembered from what they later learned. Still, the case generated names. One of them was John Tessier, the young man who would later become known as Jack McCullough. His involvement in the original investigation was important because it showed how dramatically the interpretation of evidence could change over time. In 1957, investigators considered him and cleared him. More than 5 decades later, prosecutors accused him of being Johnny. The later conviction relied heavily on testimony and circumstances that were interpreted differently from the way investigators had understood them in the 1950s. That difference became the foundation of the later legal controversy. McCullough's attorneys challenged the conviction, and the old evidence concerning his whereabouts became increasingly important. The telephone call from Rockford was particularly significant because it had been documented at the time. The military recruitment encounter also provided another piece of the timeline. The defense argued that these records supported the conclusion reached by the original investigators. Tessier was not the man who abducted Marie. When the conviction was eventually vacated, those historical records became more than just details in an old file. They became reminders that evidence created close to the event can sometimes carry a different weight from memories reconstructed decades later. But the exoneration did not solve the original crime. It simply removed one suspect, and once that happened, the investigation faced the daunting task of looking beyond the most recent theory. The search had to widen again. Who else had been in Sycamore that evening? Who else could have known Maria? Who else might have approached the girls without immediately alarming them? Had Johnny been local? Had he been passing through? Had he used a false name? Was he someone Maria had seen before? These questions had existed in 1957, but now they returned without the distraction of a convicted suspect. The case became a study in the danger of tunnel vision. Once investigators believe they have identified the perpetrator, other possibilities naturally receive less attention. Files can be closed. leads can be downgraded. People can stop asking questions. When that suspect is later exonerated, the investigation has to rebuild the landscape from the beginning. That process is difficult because the original witnesses may no longer be alive, and the original investigators may have left behind incomplete records. Maria's case had all of those problems. More than 50 years had transformed the people who had been closest to the investigation. Some were elderly, some had died, others had memories that were no longer as sharp as they once were. Yet the case still contained an important advantage. The original investigation had been extensive. There were records, there were reports, there were names, there were statements made when the events were still fresh. Those materials provided investigators with something modern technology could not create, a record of what people said before the case became part of history. Comparing those early statements with later recollections could reveal inconsistency. It could also reveal details that had remained stable for decades. Both kinds of information were valuable. If a witness described something consistently from the beginning, investigators could have greater confidence that the memory had not been entirely reconstructed later. If the details changed significantly, investigators had to understand why. The challenge was particularly important with Kathy because her childhood memories had become intertwined with the entire history of the case. She had lived for decades knowing that her friend had been murdered. She had heard theories. She had seen the investigation evolve. She had eventually been asked to identify a man who was accused of being Johnny. That process made her testimony both powerful and vulnerable. She was not merely remembering a childhood encounter in isolation. She was remembering it within the context of a national murder case that had followed her for most of her life. That did not mean her memory was false. It meant investigators had to examine the conditions under which the memory had survived and changed. The distinction between confidence and accuracy became critical. A person can be completely convinced that a memory is correct and still be mistaken. Confidence can increase with repeated recollection. A face can become familiar because it has been seen repeatedly in connection with a story, even if it was not the face originally. This phenomenon is particularly important in historical criminal cases where witnesses may be exposed to photographs, newspaper reports, documentaries, and conversations about suspects. The Maria Rudolph investigation ultimately demonstrated why such evidence must be treated cautiously. The state had once relied on the identification strongly enough to secure a conviction. Later proceedings showed that the conviction could not stand. The lesson was devastating. A sincere witness could contribute to a mistaken conclusion, and when that conclusion involves decades of imprisonment, the consequences are irreversible. Yet there was another side to the problem. Investigators could not simply reject eyewitness testimony because it was old. Kathy had been there. She had information that no laboratory could reproduce. Her memory might contain details that could never be recovered from physical evidence. The challenge was to determine which parts could be trusted. That required comparing her account with independent fact. Did the timing fit? Did the description fit? Did the suspect's movements fit? Did other witnesses confirm anything? Did physical evidence support the story? The stronger the independent connections, the more valuable the memory became. The weaker those connections, the more dangerous it became to rely on memory alone. This principle would become central to any future effort to understand Maria's disappearance. The case could not be solved by choosing between memory and documents. It required both. Every clue had to be tested against the others. Every contradiction had to be explained. Every suspect had to be evaluated without assuming guilt. The tragedy of the McCullough prosecution made that necessity impossible to ignore. The case also raised a painful question about the nature of closure. For decades, Maria's family had been told that the case was unsolved. Then a conviction brought a sense of resolution. But when the conviction was overturned, that resolution disappeared. What does closure mean when the person identified as the killer is later declared innocent? Is closure a verdict? Is it an explanation? Or is it the certainty that the correct person has been identified through reliable evidence? Maria's case suggested that only the last of those could truly provide justice. A conviction without certainty could cause another injustice. An exoneration without a new suspect could leave the victim's family without answers. Between those two outcomes was a painful middle ground, uncertainty, and uncertainty was where the case had spent most of its history. As investigators continued to examine the old evidence, the timeline of Maria's final evening remained one of the most important pieces. She was seen outside. Johnny approached. Kathy remembered the interaction. Maria later disappeared. Those facts were relatively stable. But what happened between those points was unknown. The killer had managed to create a gap in the historical record, and that gap had become the hiding place for the truth. Every investigation since 1957 had attempted to fill it. None had succeeded conclusively. The discovery of Maria's body had confirmed the worst fears, but it had not revealed the path that led to her death. The distance between Sycamore and Woodbine remained a physical reminder of how much investigators did not know. Somewhere along that unseen journey, Maria's fate had been sealed. The person responsible had disappeared from the evidence almost as effectively as Maria had disappeared from the street. And if Johnny was not McCullough, then the mystery became even more unsettling. A stranger had walked into the lives of two children, spoken to them, gained Maria's trust, and then vanished. Whoever he was, he had successfully escaped identification for decades. He may have lived an ordinary life afterward. He may have moved to another state. He may have changed his name. He may have died without ever confessing. Or he may have remained somewhere in the same community, carrying a secret that nobody around him could see. Investigators could not know. That uncertainty was precisely what made the case so haunting. Maria's killer did not leave behind a clear signature. He left behind questions. The most powerful clue was still the same word spoken by a child on a winter evening. Johnny. A simple name, perhaps false, perhaps real, but after more than half a century, it remained the closest thing the case had to an identity. The challenge was determining whether that name pointed toward a real person or toward a carefully constructed disguise. Until that question could be answered, the mystery would remain alive, and Maria's story would continue to resist the ending everyone had spent generations searching for. The longer investigators examined the history of Maria Ridulph's disappearance, the clearer one fact became. The case had never truly been a straight line. It was a maze of memories, records, suspicions, and unanswered questions, with each new theory forcing investigators to reconsider something they thought they already understood. At the center of that maze was still the same winter evening in Sycamore, Illinois, when 7-year-old Maria stepped outside and never returned home. The simplicity of the beginning made the decades that followed almost impossible to comprehend. There had been no warning that the evening would become historic. Maria was simply a child playing outside with her friend Kathy Sigmund. The neighborhood was familiar. The streets were ordinary. Then a young man appeared. He called himself Johnny. He spoke to the girls. He interacted with Maria, and somewhere in the short period that followed, the ordinary evening ended. Maria vanished. That disappearance created a chain reaction that would eventually involve local police, federal investigators, courts, attorneys, journalists, and generations of people who never knew Maria personally but became familiar with her face through the photographs that survived. The first search was enormous. Authorities needed to find Maria quickly because every minute mattered. They wanted to know where she had gone and whether she might still be alive. The community responded with urgency. People searched surrounding areas. Investigators questioned residents. Information was gathered from anyone who might have seen something unusual. The young man called Johnny became particularly important because Kathy had seen him with Maria. The description was circulated as investigators attempted to identify him, but the stranger remained elusive. The investigation continued even after hope began to fade. Then, months later, the discovery near Woodbine changed everything. Maria's remains were found in a wooded area, bringing confirmation of what her family had feared. The location was far from the place where she had last been seen. That distance became one of the most significant mysteries in the case. It meant that whoever had taken Maria had somehow moved her away from Sycamore and concealed her body. Investigators now had to solve not only an abduction, but a murder. The transition was devastating. The search for a missing child became a hunt for a killer. Yet the killer had already benefited from the passage of time. By the time Maria was found, months had passed. The physical evidence was limited. Traditional forensic methods could reveal some information, but there was nothing resembling the modern DNA technology that investigators would have decades later. The case, therefore, remained dependent on people and documents. Investigators examined suspects. One of them was John Tessier. He was 18 years old and lived in Sycamore. Because he matched aspects of the description of Johnny, authorities questioned him. But the investigation also produced evidence supporting his claim that he had been in Rockford. The collect telephone call from Rockford became a crucial piece of the historical record. His encounter with military recruitment officers provided another documented point in his movements. The FBI investigated and eventually cleared him. Tessier moved on with his life. The case did not. For decades, the connection between Tessier and Maria Ridulph remained largely dormant. Then the passage of time produced one of the strangest reversals in the history of the investigation. Tessier, now known as Jack McCullough, became a suspect again. The trigger was a later allegation involving a reported deathbed statement. Investigators considered the claims seriously enough to reopen the case. The old evidence was reviewed. New interviews were conducted. Kathy Sigmund was asked to revisit the memory of Johnny. She eventually identified McCullough as the man she believed she had seen with Maria. That identification became a major part of the prosecution's theory. The case that had remained unresolved for more than 50 years suddenly appeared to have a solution. In 2012, McCullough was convicted of Maria's murder and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time since 1957, there was a courtroom judgment declaring that the person responsible had been found. But the victory was fragile. The defense challenged the conviction. The old alibi evidence received renewed attention. The historical telephone record was examined again. The military recruitment encounter was reconsidered. The original FBI investigation became increasingly important, and the reliability of the decades-old identification became a major point of dispute. Eventually, in 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated. Prosecutors moved to dismiss the charges. The case against him ended. In 2017, he received a certificate of innocence. The man, once presented as Maria's killer, was legally cleared. That development did more than overturn a conviction. It changed the way the entire investigation had to be understood. The investigators who reopened the case had believed they were looking backward and finally finding the answer. Instead, they had discovered how dangerous it could be to interpret old evidence through the lens of a new theory. The original investigation could no longer be dismissed as an outdated attempt that had simply failed. Its conclusions had to be reconsidered. Why had the FBI cleared Tessier? What did the investigators know at the time? What did the telephone records show? What did witnesses say immediately after Maria disappeared? What had changed between 1957 and the 21st century? Those questions became crucial because the case now had two competing narratives. One was the original narrative. Tessier had been investigated and cleared. The other was the later narrative. Tessier was actually Johnny and had escaped responsibility for decades. The legal reversal demonstrated that the second narrative had not been sufficiently supported, but that did not automatically make the first narrative complete. The FBI could have been correct about Tessier and still wrong about other aspects of the case. The true killer could have been someone investigators never identified. That possibility brought the investigation back to its most important clue: the man who approached Maria and Kathy. The description of Johnny had been created before the case became a historical mystery. That made the earliest version of the witness account particularly important. Investigators could compare what Kathy had said as a child with what she remembered as an adult. The comparison was not necessarily about catching her in a contradiction. Human memory does not work like a recording. A child might remember the emotional impression of a stranger while forgetting exact physical characteristics. A detail that seemed unimportant at 8 might later appear significant. Conversely, a detail added later might reflect information learned after the event. The challenge was to separate the memory of the actual encounter from everything that had happened around it during the next 5 decades. This was not an easy task. Maria's case had become part of Kathy's life story. The disappearance had not been an isolated childhood memory. It had followed her through adulthood. She had lived with the knowledge that her friend had been murdered after they played together. She had watched the case remain unsolved. She had eventually watched a man be accused and convicted. Then she watched that conviction collapse. All of those experiences existed around the original memory. That did not make her testimony meaningless. It made it something that had to be evaluated carefully. The same problem existed with other witnesses. People who had been interviewed in 1957 had spent decades living with the case. Some might have remembered details differently over time. Some might have repeated information heard from others. Some might have forgotten entire conversations. Investigators, therefore, had to rely heavily on original documents whenever possible. The closer a statement was to the event, the less opportunity there had been for later information to influence it. That made the original case files valuable in ways that had not always been obvious when they were first created. A cold case investigator is often working with history rather than fresh evidence. The file becomes a time capsule. Inside it are statements from people who may no longer be alive, records from agencies that have changed, and observations made by investigators who could not have imagined that their work would still be examined decades later. Maria's file contained exactly that kind of history. Every report represented a decision. Every suspect represented a path the investigation had considered. Every cleared person represented an explanation that investigators had rejected. To understand the case, investigators needed to understand not only what they believed, but why they believed it. That distinction could reveal where the original investigation had been strong and where it might have contained blind spots. The same principle applied to the later prosecution. Why did investigators come to believe that McCullough was Johnny? Which evidence led them there? Which evidence contradicted the theory? And why did the court eventually reject the conviction? These questions were essential because the failed prosecution had become part of the evidence history itself. It showed that a theory could appear convincing until the underlying assumptions were tested. The lesson was particularly important in a case with no definitive physical evidence. When there is a DNA match, investigators can often establish a powerful biological connection. When there is a video recording, they can examine the event directly. When there is a fingerprint or another uniquely identifying piece of forensic evidence, the suspect can sometimes be linked to the crime without relying heavily on memory. Maria's case lacked that kind of decisive evidence. That made the investigation inherently vulnerable to interpretation. The killer had left behind a story, but not an obvious signature. The case, therefore, demanded patience. It demanded skepticism, and above all, it demanded a willingness to admit when an answer was not supported strongly enough. That was difficult because the human instinct is to seek closure. Maria's family had waited decades. The community had waited decades. Investigators wanted to say that the mystery was over, but justice could not be measured simply by whether a suspect had been named. Justice required identifying the correct person and proving the connection. Anything less risked creating another victim. The exoneration of McCullough proved that risk was real. The case, therefore, became a warning to anyone who believed that time automatically makes a cold case easier to solve. Time can preserve records, but it can also destroy evidence. Time can allow technology to improve, but it can also take witnesses away. Time can expose forgotten information, but it can also distort memory. Every advantage comes with a cost. Maria's case carried all of those contradictions. The longer investigators looked, the more complicated the truth became. Yet there was still one fact that could not be disputed. Maria had been alive when she was playing with Kathy. A young man had appeared. Maria disappeared. Months later, her body was found. Everything else was interpretation. That was why the identity of Johnny remained so important. Whoever he was, he represented the last known human connection between Maria and the unknown events that followed. If investigators could establish who he was through reliable evidence, the case might finally move forward. But if Johnny was merely a false name, then the investigation had to find another path. Perhaps the man had given a false identity because he knew exactly what he intended to do. Perhaps he had been using a nickname that would make identification difficult. Perhaps he had been known in the community under another name, or perhaps the memory of the name itself had become distorted over time. None of those possibilities could be ruled out completely. The mystery remained alive because the evidence refused to point in one direction with absolute certainty. More than half a century had passed since Maria walked outside. The world had entered the digital age, but her case remained rooted in an analog pattern. The evidence lived in paper files. The memories lived in aging witnesses. The streets where the girls once played had become part of a different era, and the person responsible had remained hidden behind the passage of time. The tragedy was not only that Maria had been murdered, it was that the truth about her final moments had been carried away with her. Someone knew what happened. Someone had always known. The question was whether that knowledge still existed in a form investigators could recover, and as the old case continued to resist every attempt at closure, the possibility remained that the most important clue had been overlooked, not because it was invisible, but because nobody had yet understood what it meant. The Maria Ridulph case had reached a point where the past itself had become the crime scene, and every surviving document, every remembered conversation, and every disputed recollection had to be examined with the understanding that the most obvious answer had already failed. Jack McCullough was no longer the legally accepted solution. His conviction had been vacated, the charges had been dismissed, and in 2017 he received a certificate of innocence. That left investigators facing the same terrible question that had haunted Sycamore since 1957. If McCullough was not responsible, then who was? The answer could not simply be another name chosen because it seemed to fit. The history of the case had already shown what could happen when a theory became stronger than the evidence supporting it. The next step had to be different. Investigators had to return to the earliest known facts before the case became surrounded by decades of speculation. Maria was 7 years old. Kathy was 8. The girls were outside in Sycamore on December 3, 1957. A young man approached them and called himself Johnny. He interacted with the children. Kathy later described him to investigators. Maria eventually disappeared. Those were the critical facts. Everything after that had to be tested against them. The question was whether the man called Johnny had ever been correctly identified. The original investigators had searched for him, but no confirmed identification emerged. The search took place in an era when police depended heavily on physical descriptions, photographs, interviews, and word of mouth. A young man could cross a county line without leaving a digital trace. A vehicle could pass through town without being captured on camera. A person could use a nickname or false name and leave behind almost nothing. Today, investigators can reconstruct movements through cameras, electronic transactions, mobile devices, and digital communications. None of those tools existed when Maria disappeared. The original detectives were working in a world where a person could simply vanish from the investigative record. That technological limitation mattered enormously. The killer did not have to defeat a sophisticated forensic system. He only had to avoid being recognized. And if Johnny was not from Sycamore, the challenge became even greater. Investigators could circulate a description, but descriptions are inherently imperfect. Height can be estimated incorrectly, hair can be remembered differently. Facial features can blend together in memory. Clothing can be forgotten. A child may notice a person's voice or manner more strongly than physical details. The result is a description that can narrow a search without identifying a person. This was one reason the case remained so difficult. Kathy had information, but not enough information to provide certainty. Her memory was important because she had been there. Yet the legal history of the case demonstrated that memory alone could not safely carry the burden of proving guilt. The tragedy was that Maria had no opportunity to provide another witness statement. Kathy was the surviving witness to the encounter. The rest of the story had to be reconstructed from circumstances. Then there was the discovery of Maria's remains near Woodbine. That location provided investigators with a physical endpoint, but the events between Sycamore and Woodbine remained largely hidden. The body had been concealed beneath a partially fallen tree. The wooded environment allowed the remains to remain undiscovered for months. That fact suggested that whoever had left Maria there had chosen a location that offered concealment, but even that conclusion had limits. The killer might have known the area. The killer might have discovered it by chance. The killer might have chosen it because it was remote. There was no definitive evidence establishing why that particular place had been selected. Without that information, investigators could not easily build a profile of the person responsible. They could only infer that the killer had succeeded in moving Maria away from the original neighborhood and concealing her. The investigation, therefore, had to look at opportunity. Who could have approached Maria that evening? Who could have transported her? Who had access to a vehicle? Who could have left Sycamore without attracting attention? Who might have known the surrounding roads? These questions were not enough to identify a killer, but they could narrow the field. Yet, after more than 50 years, many of the people who might have answered them were gone. Some had died naturally, others had moved away. Families had scattered, businesses had closed, buildings had changed. Even the physical landscape had evolved. Investigators were trying to reconstruct a world that no longer existed. That made the original records especially valuable. The reports created in 1957 preserved details from a time when witnesses were still close to the event. Those records could reveal what investigators knew before later theories developed. They could show whether a particular suspect had been investigated, whether an alibi had been verified, and whether a witness had ever mentioned a particular person. They could also expose gaps. Sometimes a cold case breakthrough begins with something as simple as discovering that an assumption made decades earlier was never actually proven. Perhaps a witness had never been properly re-interviewed. Perhaps an alibi had been accepted without sufficient verification. Perhaps a name had been dismissed because investigators lacked the technology to connect it to the crime. In Maria's case, those possibilities were particularly important because the original investigation had been extensive but not omniscient. No investigation can examine every person with equal intensity. Detectives make decisions based on the information available at the time. If the wrong person appears suspicious, resources can shift toward that person. If another individual appears harmless, that person may receive little attention. A cold case review can change that balance because investigators can revisit every decision with decades of hindsight. But hindsight has its own danger. Knowing what happened can make old clues appear obvious, even when they were not obvious at the time. Investigators must resist the temptation to judge earlier detectives by information they could never have possessed. The goal is not to criticize the past. It is to understand it. In Maria's case, that meant asking why certain people were investigated, why others were cleared, and which conclusions were supported by evidence. The McCullough episode made this approach essential. He had once been cleared, later convicted, and finally exonerated. That sequence proved that neither the original clearance nor the later conviction should be accepted simply because authority had issued it. Each conclusion had to be examined independently. The case also demonstrated how a single new allegation could completely redirect a decades-old investigation. The reported deathbed statement had been enough to bring McCullough back into the story. But an allegation is not the same as proof. A statement made by someone who was not available for cross-examination could be difficult to verify. Investigators needed independent evidence. The later identification by Kathy appeared to provide such support, but the courts ultimately found serious problems with the conviction. That experience reinforced the importance of corroboration. If a witness identifies a suspect decades later, investigators should ask what other evidence connects that suspect to the crime. If there is an old record showing the suspect was somewhere else, that record must be addressed. If there is no physical evidence, investigators must be even more cautious. In Maria's case, the lack of a definitive physical connection was a major weakness. The investigation could establish that Maria had been murdered. It could establish where she had last been seen. It could establish where her body was discovered, but it could not establish, through uncontested forensic evidence, who had killed her. That gap was enormous. Modern investigators often hope that technology can bridge such gaps. DNA can sometimes identify a perpetrator decades later. Genetic genealogy can connect an unknown suspect to relatives. Advances in forensic testing can sometimes recover information from evidence that was previously considered useless. But not every cold case contains recoverable DNA. Not every crime leaves behind biological material. And even when biological evidence exists, it must first be located, preserved, and suitable for testing. Maria's case was more than half a century old. Any surviving evidence had to be evaluated carefully. The challenge was not simply finding a laboratory capable of testing something. It was determining whether anything existed that could still produce a meaningful result. The absence of such a breakthrough meant investigators continued to rely on the human record. Names became clues. Timelines became clues. Old statements became clues. And every inconsistency became a possible doorway into the past. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the possibility that someone who knew the truth had remained silent for decades. If the killer had been an adult in 1957, that person would have lived through an entire lifetime carrying knowledge of what happened to Maria. The person could have married, worked, raised children, moved away, and grown old without ever being publicly identified. Perhaps the killer had confessed privately to someone. Perhaps a family member had suspected something but never reported it. Perhaps someone had remembered seeing Maria with a stranger but never understood that the observation was important. Cold cases often depend on precisely those kinds of forgotten details. A person who witnessed something ordinary may not recognize its significance until decades later, when a news story or renewed investigation suddenly connects the memory to a crime. That possibility remained open in Maria's case. The passage of time could therefore work in two opposite ways. It could destroy evidence, but it could also bring hidden information to the surface. Someone might finally decide to speak. Someone might discover an old letter. A family might find a photograph. A forgotten document might emerge from an attic or archive. A person who had once dismissed a strange encounter might suddenly realize that it mattered. The mystery had survived because the evidence was incomplete, but incomplete did not mean permanently inaccessible. The problem was that investigators could not know where the missing piece was hidden. Every possible lead had to be evaluated, and because the case had already produced a wrongful conviction, the standard had to be exceptionally high. The objective could not be simply to identify someone who seemed suspicious. It had to be to establish a connection that could withstand scrutiny. That distinction was critical for Maria's family. After decades of waiting, another uncertain answer would not be justice. They needed the truth. They needed to know who had taken Maria and what evidence proved it. The case therefore remained open in the most painful sense of the word. There was no final name, no definitive explanation, no undisputed account of the events after Maria left the street. The identity of Johnny remained unresolved, yet the case continued to generate questions because every unanswered detail represented a possibility. Maybe Johnny was a local man. Maybe he was passing through. Maybe the name was false. Maybe the killer was someone investigators had once questioned. Maybe the crucial clue was hidden in a file that had been overlooked. Or maybe the truth had already been discovered and lost beneath decades of conflicting interpretations. The investigation had entered a battle against time, but time had one weakness. It could not change the original fact. Somewhere, Maria had been with Kathy. Somewhere, Johnny had appeared. Somewhere, Maria had disappeared. Somewhere, her body had been left near Woodbine. Those events had happened once in a specific sequence at specific times and places. The truth was not changing. Only humanity's understanding of it was changing, and that meant the path to solving the case might not require inventing a new story. It might require finding the original story buried beneath everything that came afterward. The question remained terrifyingly simple. What did investigators know in the first hours after Maria disappeared that had later been forgotten? Somewhere in those first reports, before theories took shape and before decades of memory began to reshape the story, there might have been a detail pointing toward the man who called himself. And if that detail still existed, it could be more valuable than any theory created afterward. The case had already taught investigators one lesson the hard way. Certainty could be manufactured from incomplete evidence. The next breakthrough would have to be different. It would have to come from something that did not depend on memory alone, something that could connect the past to the present without requiring investigators to guess. Until that evidence appeared, Maria's story remained suspended between history and mystery, waiting for someone to find the missing piece. The mystery surrounding Maria Rodolphe had survived because the most important moments of her final evening were never captured in a form that could be examined with absolute certainty. There was no recording of the conversation with John. There was no photograph of the stranger standing beside the girl. There was no modern forensic profile waiting inside a database. There was only the testimony of a child, the records created by investigators, and the physical evidence recovered months later. More than half a century after Maria disappeared, that fragile collection of evidence had already produced one conviction and one exoneration. The lesson was impossible to ignore. The next attempt to explain what happened could not simply repeat the old assumptions. It had to begin with the facts that had survived unchanged. Maria had been outside with Kathy Sigmund on the evening of December 3rd, 1957. The girls were playing near their homes in Sycamore. A young man approached them. He called himself Johnny. Kathy remembered interacting with him. Maria remained with him after Kathy eventually left. Then Maria disappeared. Her body was discovered the following spring near Woodbine. Those facts formed the foundation of everything that followed. The problem was that the most important part of the story existed only in the space between them. What happened after Kathy left? Where did Maria go? How did she become separated from the neighborhood? Who transported her? Why was she taken to the wooded location? And most importantly, who was the man called John? Every answer seemed to lead toward another uncertainty. Investigators had tried to solve those questions in 1957 and 1958, but the technology of the era imposed severe limitations. A missing child could trigger an enormous search, yet the search still depended on human observation. Officers could knock on doors, agents could examine records, witnesses could be questioned, descriptions could be distributed, but once a person moved beyond the immediate area, the investigation became increasingly dependent on chance. There was no digital trail following the movements of strangers. There were no databases containing every face. There were no cameras watching intersections. A person could disappear from the investigative landscape simply by leaving town. This was one of the reasons the identity of Johnny remained so elusive. The description gave investigators a starting point, but a description is not an identity. It is an approximation, and when the witness providing it is a child, the limitations become even more significant. Kathy had no reason to believe that she was looking at the last person who would ever be seen with Maria. She was not trained to memorize faces. She did not know that the stranger's appearance would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in a murder investigation. She experienced the moment as a child experiences an ordinary encounter. The meaning came later. That difference mattered. Human memory is not a photograph. It is reconstructed every time it is recalled. A memory can remain emotionally vivid while individual details shift. A person may remember the feeling of an encounter with extraordinary clarity while becoming less certain about the exact face, clothing, height, or sequence of events. Over decades, new information can become attached to the original memory. This does not require deception. It